Hey, what's up guys? I'm Praetorian and welcome back to our sponsored Call of War series. This is the third and final episode in that series. So while the second video covered from day 0 to day 12, which ended up being exactly halfway through the campaign since it did take 24 days for a victor to emerge, this video here will be covering the latter half of the campaign from day 13 to the final day of day 24. So if you recall from the last episode, we left off with the Legion pretty much gaining complete control of North America, with a few exceptions up in the far northwest, where we had kind of allowed some AI countries to continue to exist as, you know, associate member states, I would say. So other than that, we had completely conquered all of North America, and Angola, our fifth member of the coalition, had completely conquered, again, for the most part. There were a couple AI countries still existing, but had essentially conquered all of Africa. So after conquering our two home continents, it was now time for the Legion to extend our influence and power into other continents in the world. So I think we had left off discussing my initial moves on day 13, and of course that was the invasion of Venezuela, and then the preparation for the invasion of France. Now, both of these countries were former players that had gone inactive and were now both under the control of the AI. And we'll cover Venezuela first and what happened there. And actually, we're going to go and take a look at what South America looks now here at the end of the game, because frankly, South America was just not a major area of conflict, because again, as I mentioned in the previous video, all of the players here did eventually go inactive, so it just wasn't a important area. And frankly, we didn't want to just go after AI countries. You'll see a little bit later what we did decide to do, but we did not want to just if we were going to get victory, we didn't want to do it by just conquering a bunch of AI controlled countries. By the time that we were invading South America, there was still what we thought was an active player, and that was also, I think, the second, or by this point he might have been the third highest scoring player after me. I'm not entirely sure if I had achieved second yet. Sichuan was also pretty high rated at this point as well. So I'm not entirely sure where he sat on the rankings, but he was still a very high ranking player. But he hadn't done much for a few days, so we weren't entirely sure if he was active or not. So we decided to probe him a little bit. So I attacked Venezuela to see what he would do, if he would react at all, if he'd send me a message or post something in the newspaper. And he didn't. So then again, he could have not have noticed it. So Angola decided to try a little quick invasion just to see if he reacted, and if he did react, how he would react to it. So this was not really meant to be, the real invasion that was going to achieve victory for Angola. This was just like, again, just a probing action, just to see how he would react. And he didn't react at all. So therefore we knew that WWII was not an active player, and he was clearly gone, and Angola would quickly start conquering all his territory, while I continued fighting AI Venezuela, which again was actually under control of the AI, while WWII was not yet. It wasn't going to be until I think the day after our invasion of WWII that the AI would take over, and then he would start fighting Angola, where his casualties would go up a little bit, because he hadn't really fought most of WWII's troops yet. He was just kind of taking the unoccupied territory, because at that point we knew exactly where all his units were. So he was kind of avoiding fighting his units initially and just kind of conquering his territory. And so the casualties did end up going up there a little bit once the AI took over, but overall it was pretty easy conflict for Angola. And I would take his northern territory, which was right up here. I'd take this little patch from WWII, and all this was, I think, completely undefended at that point. But it would take me a little while to do that, because the invasion of Venezuela did take, I think like 2 days or something like that, and that was largely because AI Venezuela had built a ton of troops. Now, I don't know if the player had done this back before he left, or if this was all the AI's doing, but Venezuela had a fairly large army. It wasn't a great army. It was largely just infantry, anti-air, and anti-tank. Not a lot of artillery, not really many tanks, and really no air power. I think they only had one interceptor, and that was it. That's all they had. And it ended up being just a bloodbath. There was a point, because I didn't send many troops, and I did kind of build my army out to fight Goius, who had a very large air force. His army wasn't actually all that impressive. It seemed like he really relied on air power. So I had brought a lot of AA, because this army that I was fighting Venezuela with, I intended would also fight Goius. And so I had a lot of AA, which was pretty much useless against Venezuela. Luckily, some of it was self-propelled, so I was able to kind of use that to help take territory, so it wasn't completely useless. But for the most part, my army was not very large. Again, it was more of a, kind of like Angola's attack, more of a probing action to see what Goius would do. So my initial invasion was not real strong, but I had enough artillery to kind of keep the Venezuelans off of me while I eventually launched a second invasion here of their capital with a few more units. And overall, I didn't send a lot of troops, and I was able to conquer Venezuela with just a small amount of units. I largely just relied on artillery to kill a large number of them without taking too many casualties myself. But again, it did take a while just because there's so many units, and unfortunately, I had a cruiser fleet over here trying to help me out, but there just weren't very many units along the coast. So eventually, I'd send that cruiser fleet up to Europe to help out there. But yeah, it was it was a pretty easy conflict. It was just time consuming, took a lot of time to kill all those units, and unfortunately a lot of Venezuelans died because they just didn't want to submit to the rule of the Legion. So while I was doing that, HiJynx was finishing up in Mexico, and then she invaded Colombia, which had control of the Panama Canal. I want to say, so Panama was originally a AI country that Colombia, while it was still under the control of the player, had conquered them. And HiJynx invaded them, took over Panama, and eventually got all of Colombia conquered. And then from there, she invaded Peru. So she conquered Peru, and Peru was a little bit trickier. They had a lot of units. HiJynx's army by that point was also had taken some casualties across the conflict. And then she had several provinces that rebelled on her as well due to the morale mechanic. So several provinces that she had conquered from Colombia actually rebelled and went over to Peru. And so she had a little bit of trouble with Peru, but overall eventually got them knocked out. From there, we then both, and I think I took a few provinces of Colombia, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I helped her out a little bit. Took a couple provinces here. There was units throughout these provinces that I bombarded with my artillery and quickly killed, and then took these couple of border provinces here. And then from there, we then both invaded the West Amazons, which was an AI country, and so we conquered them fairly quickly. And then we had thought about going into the East Amazons, but you can see that our troops here were kind of in position to do so, which again, we don't really have large armies here, but with the AI, you can kind of just rely on your artillery and your air power to take them out. Now this country here actually had a lot more troops, as you can see, which at that point we didn't know what they had, but you can see they actually have some artillery. I think it would have been a little bit tougher fight just because of that, but overall I'm sure we would have got them conquered. Of course, we never did actually invade them because the campaign did end before that. But this is the South America situation. Again, it wasn't a major area of conflict, so I just wanted to kind of go over everything that happened here early on. So as we had begun to wrap up North America, we kind of really got together and decided where each respective member of our coalition was going to expand to next. And for me, it was always Europe. It had to be Europe. I had that initial conflicts with France that we had mentioned in the previous video, and I had always been kind of working against the EU throughout the campaign. I looked at they were the primary rival there, and just the fact that I knew that France wanted conflict with us meant that the EU was a kind of a natural rival for the Legion. So I was always trying to act against them. They had that coalition between Sweden, Italy, and France, and thus they were the strongest power in Europe. So I was always trying to help create a coalition to kind of rival them while we were focused on, wrapping up North America. So the first country that I was really trying to kind of build this coalition with was Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was just completely surrounded by enemies. Of course, they were eventually attacked by the EU and completely broken up and conquered by them, with Italy gaining much of their northern territory and Greece gaining much of the southern territory, with Poland taking, I think, mostly Romania. They had conquered Romania. which had also been split up in a previous war. And I want to say Yugoslavia might have been involved in that conflict. Romania actually kind of irritated everybody because after he got conquered, he declared, or when he was getting conquered, I think, he declared war on every single country in the game, which does give you a morale penalty. You get a negative 5% morale penalty for every country you're at war with, up to negative 25%. So a lot of people were kind of irritated about Romania declaring war on everybody. But on the roleplay perspective, we kind of looked at it as the Romanian leader had gone insane and had declared war on every other country in the world. Again, he eventually got split up, and then that left the EU completely surrounding Yugoslavia. So I had got together with Spain and Yugoslavia, and they had agreed that they would create a coalition to kind of oppose the EU, but kind of protect themselves more than anything, not really an aggressive coalition, more of a defensive pact. And I wanted them to create a new coalition. I also contacted Poland and asked him where he stood on this. He had told me that he was friendly with the EU and he wanted to join them, which at this point he hadn't yet. So I just kind of quickly told him when he asked me why I was asking, that I was just trying to see who was friendly with the EU, because I'm friends with France and I just want to make sure that they don't have any enemies in Europe, and just kind of know who their enemies are. And so that I was glad that Poland was friends with the EU. And he eventually did join the EU. So wasn't able to do anything with him, but I wanted them to start their own coalition. But they were really set on joining the German coalition. So Germany had their own coalition, I think was called the Pact of Steel, if I'm not mistaken. And he had never been very active throughout the game. He was active enough to not be taken over by the AI, but I had sent him many messages that he didn't respond to for, I think 4 or 5 days after I had sent him. And similarly, I think Spain and Yugoslavia were also sending him messages that weren't initially being responded to. And you could tell that he wasn't really building a lot. And he had been attacked by Italy and had a big chunk of his territory, I think, taken fairly early by the Italians. So he just wasn't a very active player. So I didn't think it was a good idea to have everybody ally with them, but that's what they ended up doing. They ended up joining the German faction, and it eventually resulted in them all either being conquered or going AI. So I think Yugoslavia was conquered first, and then eventually both Germany and Spain would go completely inactive and the AI would take over. And shortly before Spain went inactive, France did as well, got taken over by the AI. So I had kind of 2 points where I could enter Europe, either France or Spain. Neither one of them were part of a coalition since they were both under the control of the AI. That did result in France leaving the EU, and Sweden became the new leader of the EU. So you had Sweden and Italy, and eventually they would bring in new members of the EU. Greece would join the European Union, as would Ukraine and Poland. So it ended up being a full 5-member coalition: Sweden, Poland, Italy, Greece, and Ukraine. So I had many places to enter, and I figured the best location to invade first would be France because of our the unique relationship between Americans and France. I think it made a lot of sense for me to invade into there, especially given the fact they didn't have a leader. They had attacked Morocco back when they were still under control of a player, and that invasion was not going well. It was taking forever. It was just an absolute mess. The casualties were extremely high for France because, again, there wasn't anybody controlling their units for so long against AI Morocco. And so that was kind of my casus belli. My justification is to go help the French people who had no leader and were just, completely leaderless, and needed the assistance of glorious New England and the Legion. So as I mentioned last episode, the United Kingdom had been a secret ally of the Legion for the entire match. And so we had agreed on a simultaneous invasion of France. I would invade the north from the United Kingdom. I brought my railroad guns, I brought my air force, so I was going to bombard all the enemy units along the coast. I also had my navy there as well, a cruiser navy. I think I had a battleship by that point when I attacked France. I might be wrong. The battleship might not have been there yet, so it might have just been cruisers. But yeah, I had some ships that could help with the bombardment of enemy units as well. And overall, my landing in northern France went extremely smoothly, very easy. While the UK was set to invade southern France. and he was supposed to take the territories along the Italian border because I was worried that as soon as I invaded France, that Italy would also invade France to make sure that we weren't able to get too much territory. So the plan here was that the UK was going to take all of that border territory as quickly as possible so that the Italians couldn't get it. And most importantly, that was very mountainous terrain, so we could fortify up there, and the UK could, defend that territory. And that would have to, if the Italians were going to declare war, they'd have to declare war on the UK, which, at this point might become kind of clear that they were working with us, but they were also technically neutral. They were not a member of our coalition officially. They were not a member of the Legion. So they'd have to declare war on the UK rather than me if they wanted to fight me in order to kick me out of Europe. So that was kind of the plan, the way we wanted to do it. Though Italy at this point, it was kind of seemed a bit clear that they might be inactive. They're still technically under the control of the player. However, my spies had revealed a couple days before I invaded France that the Italians had were in the process of moving every unit in their country to Sicily. And eventually, by the point that we had invaded here, all of his units, every single unit in all of Italy, was in Sicily. It was like 60-something units plus a couple planes. So the Italians could have been doing this for two reasons. One, he knew he was going completely inactive, and thus he was just going to, I don't know why he would move his whole army onto Sicily. I don't see how that is helpful. But maybe he did it for that reason. Maybe he was just planning on going inactive for a couple days, and so he wanted to make sure he kept his army intact in case somebody did invade him. I'm not sure what the logic was of moving his whole army to Sicily. So we knew this would make the conquest of Italy pretty easy if we wanted to invade them. Again, they were officially part of the European Union, though, so invading them could result in war with the whole coalition. But if we wanted to invade them, we knew it would be really easy because all of his units was on Sicily. So therefore, our navy could keep them from ever leaving the island, or that was the idea here. So that should be mentioned that Italy was probably inactive, but we were kind of planning for, just in case he was still playing. So my invasion of France went very smooth, very low casualties, very quick, and pretty easy overall. But there were some issues. The UK had trouble in the south, and at this point, I think he was preparing himself to go inactive. I think he was also, for whatever reason, was deciding he was going to play the game as much. So during this invasion, he just was not very active at all. So kind of similar to what we talked about last episode with Illinois, he just kind of put all of his armies, which again were not artillery. There was no artillery, there was no air force for the most part. It was pretty much just composed of tanks and infantry, and maybe some anti-tanks as well, and just was basically ordering his troops to just run forward and attack into cities and mountains, places where his tanks would not do very well, which I think a good chunk of his army was tanks. And so he had them invade into terrain that just they didn't do very well in. They do get that massive penalty, I think 50% negative penalty in the cities and negative 25% penalty in the mountains. And that was the terrain that he was attacking into. And so they didn't do very well. They took very high casualties. They lost entire armies. Now, luckily, he did bring a lot of units, so he was eventually to come back able to get into the game and kind of wrap it up. But he took a lot of casualties in that invasion of France, and unfortunately, he wasn't able to take all of his provinces in time because an incident would eventually arise that would require me to hurry up and get this done. So I had to invade into several of the provinces that initially he was assigned to do, but I needed them done, and I couldn't have an enemy because France still had many units in those provinces, and so I couldn't have those enemy units on my backside. So I eventually ended up taking over, about half of the provinces. I think he was assigned to take over because, again, I feel like he was kind of going inactive by this point, and then perhaps not exactly understanding certain mechanics and how best to play the game. Again, a lot of new players in here, so everybody's got to learn. I had the benefit of playing previous campaigns and kind of making my mistakes in those ones. But for many people, this was the first campaign they did, so they didn't exactly know how to play and how the best way to use your units and how to build your army. So again, he did take very high casualties. By the end of the actual campaign in France, I kind of wished that he hadn't been there. I think it would have been a lot easier if I could have just taken over that territory myself, if I had been able to deal with those units myself. So I kind of feel like UK being involved was actually a handicap in the long run, especially because he did take over two of France's cities, industrial cities, for building units. But you'll notice that my gold did drop by about 5,000 or so, which I said I would mention any large amounts of gold use, which there hasn't been much of it in this campaign so far. I haven't used, at this point, I hadn't used any huge chunks of gold for the most part, other than any ones I might have previously mentioned. And I'd use that gold to build up those 2 cities I had, since I only had the 2 cities in Europe to build in. So I wanted to hurry up and get them producing units immediately. So I used the gold for that, also to get a lot of buildings constructed in there, so I had a more larger variety of units that I could construct in Europe. Because yeah, I didn't want to, I'll tell you what, it took a long time to shuttle units across, about 2 days to get units from my homeland to France. And then it would take even longer to then get them to the front, as the front moved further into Europe. So I really wanted to get units producing quicker, because he just can't be waiting days for reinforcements and for new units. So again, I did use that 5,000 gold to kind of get those cities building a little bit quicker. So let's go ahead and dip over here in day 24. Day 24, I think it's technically day 25, because I think you got to wait for the end of day to happen in order for it to calculate the points and who had won. So let's go ahead and dip on over to Europe, and you guys can kind of see how it looks. And I know this is kind of spoiler in a way. You guys know exactly what's going to be happening next. But I think it is important for me to be able to show exactly what's going on over here. So again, I only gained control of these 2 cities here, while the United Kingdom gained control of the other 2 French cities. So that did limit my ability to build here. So I kind of feel like having the UK involved was probably a negative in the long run. And just so you guys know what day we're on here, on day 13 I invaded both Venezuela and France, so France was towards the end of the day. But yeah, I invaded both of those on day 13. Venezuelan war again went from, through day 14. I think it wrapped up on day 15. Here in France, again, it was a very quick war. I think I had it wrapped up by day 14. I had taken out, all the territory I was supposed to take. It was less than 24 hours to get them completely destroyed. The areas that I was supposed to conquer. Most of that was just moving units through the provinces. So it was a very quick invasion here in France, and I think by day 15, I had even wrapped up this little bit of territory, and the UK had finished up too. So once we delve into the continuing conflict in Europe, I really want to focus on that. So before we do, I should mention something else that had happened on day 14 that had kind of, again, my focus was very much on Europe, but it did kind of sidetrack me a little bit, where I had to start preparing for conflict in another area around the world. So on day 14, here in Alaska, and you guys will see here that it is all under control of our coalition, with the exception of one province, which is under the control of East Yakutua. So East Yakutua had invaded into the province of Nome here, which I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, or if it's like Nome or something like that, but we'll call it Nome. So he had done a naval invasion here and invaded into this province. So of course that was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, he had already conquered all this territory here, and I knew he was coming here, and we saw that. And why British Columbia, who was again right here, had not conquered these 2 AI countries, I couldn't really say. He would have to say for himself why he decided to not conquer them, but he didn't, and that did leave it open for several people to take advantage of that. So I had mentioned in the previous episode that Northwest USA had 1 unit left that he was selling around the world with, apparently, and he did conquer this province. He invaded in here, but I don't think it went well. I think the AI eventually attacked him and pushed him back, because he didn't hold it for very long before he lost it again. But that was the first attack, and then shortly after that, again, East Yakutua here invaded Nome. And so you see 2 different countries now taking advantage of the fact that the AI was still present here, that this was not under direct control of the Legion. So it caused some serious issues for us, and I did kind of allude to that last episode, that this would become a problem, and it absolutely did. I contacted East Yakutua, told him, like, hey, this is a violation of the new Monroe Doctrine, for you to, invade into North America, and, I demanded that he give the province up to British Columbia, and that he evacuate all of his troops. So as I said before, the whole coalition had, got together and determined where we were going to be focusing our efforts on after the conquest of North America, and British Columbia was going to be going into Japan. I think this is a great point to just kind of briefly mention what had gone on in Asia up to this point. Now, I can't really discuss the details of the conflict over there because I wasn't privy to them. Obviously, I was concentrated on other areas, specifically North America and Europe. So I don't know exactly what was happening there. But there was two large coalitions, and I think I mentioned this briefly last episode, and those were the Second United Front, and the official leader of that was Communist China, though Sichuan, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Hopefully Sichuan. That's how I'm going to say it for the rest of this video, is Sichuan. He kind of seemed more like the leader, but he was one member. Of course, you had East Yakutia, and then you had Siberia, and then you had South India, and those were the 5 members. They did have some other members originally who then went inactive, but towards this point of the game, those were the 5 official members of the Second United Front. And then there was another coalition in Asia, and of course that was the Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was started by Japan. So you had Japan as a member, and then the other members, and I could be wrong about all these, but I think it was Korea, Tibet, Burma, and then South China maybe, or Indochina. I'm not entirely sure all the members were, and of course coalitions were changing throughout the campaign. But you kind of get an idea of here of who all was opposed to SUF. And they had a big fight between them, and eventually the Second United Front did emerge as the victors of that conflict. Apparently it was a very fun conflict for them both. They had both told me that they had quite a bit of fun doing that fight between the two different Asian coalitions. And so by the point in the game that we're at now, here talking about day 14, there's really only Japan left. All the rest of that other coalition in Asia had been defeated, and they're now invading into Japan. And British Columbia had decided he was going to take advantage of the fact that there was only, it was just Japan, and that would be one place to kind of expand into Asia without having to actually, cause conflict with the Second United Front, or so we thought. So British Columbia had sent a cruiser, just one cruiser, unescorted cruiser, with maybe 3 units, I think, to just kind of grab a port in Japan and to, slowly expand there. And so essentially we both had mutual grievances. The SUF was not happy about us going to Japan, while we were not happy about them being here in Alaska. And so we began to have peace talks, trying to discuss a way to avoid conflict. And essentially we had come to an agreement that they would give up their territory here in Alaska and would evacuate from North America, and that British Columbia would turn his convoys around, not settle in Japan, and take his cruiser back with him. And everything seemed to be settled. But then East Yakutia decided he had more demands. He now wanted British Columbia to remove all of his ships from the international waters here in between Alaska and Siberia. And, he said he wouldn't move his troops until we did that. So again, it just felt like he was adding demands here. Now, one thing I didn't mention is the fact that we actually had a non-aggression pact with the Second United Front for much of the game at this point. Another coalition we had a non-aggression pact with for almost the entire game, I think it was since day one, was the Emu Empire, which was composed of Western Australia, Borneo, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. And those were the 4 members that were still around at this time. Again, we did discuss last episode how they had turned on their one of their members in Queensland. And so we had non-aggression pacts with both of those 2 coalitions, which were, I think, along with the EU, they were the only 3 strong coalitions still remaining in the game at this point. And so despite the fact that we had a non-aggression pact with the Second United Front, and we were in negotiating peace talks with them, Communist China, their official leader, one of his submarines attacked one of the cruisers, the one cruiser by Japan of British Columbia. And he did, of course, sink it because, an unescorted cruiser has no chance against a submarine. You do need to have destroyers to escort your capital ships. British Columbia, for some reason, had decided not to build destroyers. I don't even know if he had the tech yet. He had cruisers all over the place. He had a lot of cruisers, but no destroyers to escort him. He had submarines as well. I recall he had submarines all over the place too, but no destroyers. So he had a bunch of cruisers that were just unescorted. So Communist China attacked one of those unescorted cruisers and sunk it. And that was the beginning of the conflict between the Legion and the Second United Front. So war would, develop between our two sides, with the main front initially being here in Alaska. Now, East Yakutua then used a very large amount of gold to build up the province here in Nome. He did build, I think, every building you could get here. Air base, the infrastructure, and industrial complexes built all the way up. High-level barracks, port, the dockyard, high-level dockyard, pretty much everything you can get here, and fortifications. I think he had got it up to level 2 or level 3 fortifications here. We know he used gold because he did it all in about an hour. About an hour, he had popped out all those buildings. He even built the capital building here, so designated this province now as the capital, which allows the building of certain units. Specifically, the one that he used it for was commandos. Now, commando units are very, very good in the mountains. They have a massive bonus modifier that increases their combat ability in the mountains by quite a bit. I think it might be 100% combat increase. I might be a little bit wrong on that, but I think it's 100% increase of their combat ability. And so he built this capital here so he could start popping out commandos with the gold again. So he pumped out a ton of commando units here. And overall, because of the fortifications and all the units that he built here, Alaska became a very difficult conflict for British Columbia, since Kentucky at this point did not have an assigned location where he was going to be helping out just yet, because he was kind of rebuilding after some of the wars that we had done in North America, and we hadn't quite decided exactly where he was going to help out yet. And he was also a bit concerned that he would, due to his lack of experience, he might not be helpful. I think he said he was worried he might be a liability in anywhere that he helped us out in. So at that point, he hadn't really decided where he was going to help out, but there was an obvious location where we needed his assistance. So I had instructed Kentucky to start pumping units over here. Unfortunately, as you can see, Kentucky's core territory here is quite a bit of a distance from Alaska, so it did take him a very long time to get there. Another problem was that he moves all his units with the railroad guns. He keeps them all together. Railroad guns are one of the slowest units in the game. They're incredibly slow, and you can't upgrade that. You can see their speed here. It just doesn't get much slower than this. There might be some units slower than this, but I don't know of them. I think these are the slowest units in the game. Plus, you can't upgrade them, which in the tech tree, which many of those upgrades do increase the speed of the unit. So these are incredibly slow units, and he kept them all together, resulting in it taking even longer for his troops to get up here because he kept them all with the railroad guns, which again are probably move about half speed of most units, about a quarter of the speed of like the faster units. So very, very slow. So it took him a very long time to get up here to Alaska to help out, just because of the distance, and then also, as I said, the slowness of those railroad guns. So it took him a long time to get up here. So this war in Alaska would actually go on for quite a while due to those factors that I mentioned here. And we'll talk a bit more about the conflict with the SUF and the Legion a bit later. I just wanted to mention that it was going on when I was invading Europe, that it was another distraction where I did have to start. I had to start sending my Navy over here. But most of my focus was on Europe, but this is what the coalition was doing. So they were very much concentrating, with British Columbia and Kentucky was very much concentrating on the war with the SUF from here on out, while HiJynx and Texas was focusing on the previous conquests we had mentioned in Colombia and Peru. So that's what they were doing while I was invading Europe. Last thing I'd like to mention before we go back to Europe is an agreement that we had with the Emu Empire. So the Emu Empire, from my understanding, was very much enemies of the Second United Front throughout the entire game. And if we're over here and looking at Indochina, you'll see that all this is under the control of Western Australia. That had been the case for much of the game. And so there seemed to be conflict between the SUF and the Emu Empire about their conquest of Indochina. And, we saw constant newspaper posts between them and, wars that had happened. So from my understanding, these guys were enemies, so it made sense for the Legion to ally with the Emu Empire. We had that non-aggression pact since the very beginning of the game, and so I contacted them pretty much immediately after the war with the SUF started and asked if they wanted an alliance, which they agreed to, and so from this point on, we were under a kind of a semi-alliance. And again, we'll come back to the conflict in Asia. So back in Europe here, of course, we've wrapped up France, or just about wrapped up France. And before we had completely finished up here, because again, the UK had some trouble with several of the provinces here, Sweden and Poland in the European Union declared war on Germany. Now, Germany was an AI country. The player who was originally in control had gone inactive by that point. And so they invaded into Germany. Now, my plan with Germany was to probably leave them as a buffer state between me and Sweden and Poland, who seem to be the most active of the EU members at this point. To kind of leave it as a buffer state for a little while I conquered the Low Countries. Now, Luxembourg, I think, had been attacked by France already because, they were already under French control. So France had quickly conquered them for that one victory point there. And so there were still the Netherlands and Belgium. And I was going to conquer them despite the fact that it probably would have been a little bit more difficult war than you'd expect for such a little country, because the Belgians had built a very large air force. You can see they currently have 13 planes. They are all just interceptors. But I think at that point they probably had, I don't know exactly, maybe 10, 11 interceptors. So I wouldn't have been able to use my my bombers here without probably taking fairly heavy losses because of just how many interceptors they had. So it probably would have been a little bit harder conflict. They don't have very many land units, so I guess it would have been fairly quick. Just getting those wrapped up and then quickly taking the air bases so the fighters can't do anything. But still, it was notable the fact that they had a large air force here for such a small country. And so I was going to wrap those up first. Before I went into Germany, figure out what we were going to do with Italy. So all that was things that I was considering, finishing up before we went into Germany, kind of leave that buffer state. But with the declaration of war by Sweden and Poland, I kind of felt forced into conflict with Germany as well. I had to liberate them, help them against their conflict against the EU, and just aggressively attack them for no apparent reason, or at least unlike what we always did, the Legion, we always posted why we were declaring war on countries. We always had a casus belli, a just cause for war. The EU never publicly stated why they declared war on Germany, they just did it. So I'll show the little newspaper post I had made about this. I eventually invaded Germany as well to kind of help them out. And there wasn't a lot of resistance. There were several troops on the border that I was able to quickly take care of. There was a few troops here, Munich, guarding this area around here. But I think it was a lot easier invading Germany than it would have been, just because the German AI had brought so many so many units over to their front with the EU. Now they're fighting them. So if their purpose of this invasion was to keep me from getting German territory, it actually kind of backfired, because I think I got more territory for less cost than I would have if they hadn't done that invasion. Now again, it wasn't completely undefended, but overall it was a very easy conflict. It didn't take very high casualties, and I remember the Polish leader contacted me, shocked that I was able to conquer so much of Germany so quickly when they had made so little progress themselves. So they had conquered the capital, Berlin, Hamburg, so they had taken several key cities, while I had taken Munich and Cologne. So we kind of split Germany as far as like the ICs, but overall I had more of the German territory than they did, because I had moved very quickly. My armies at this point were largely self-propelled, very fast, motorized, mechanized armies, using medium tanks, mechanized infantry, with a heavy support from large amounts of self-propelled artillery and self-propelled anti-air, as well as I think maybe 10 planes, I think is what I had here, 5 tactical bombers and 5 fighters. And so because of how fast my army was, that was why I was able to progress through Germany so quickly, because I did have that high firepower from the self-propelled artillery and the tactical bombers. So high firepower to destroy enemy units quickly, with a very fast military that could move quickly through the provinces and take them over after the enemy units had been destroyed. After I had conquered Germany, Poland did start throwing some threats out there, talking about how there were going to be repercussions and stuff, and I automatically knew that war with the EU was going to happen sooner rather than later. And while part of me wanted to start concentrating on the conflict with the SUF, because my coalition at that point was having some difficulty with them. We hadn't, they had been planning this invasion that they had done for a while. We had found out. So we, on the other hand, were kind of concentrating on other things. So they were in a better position initially in the war than we were. So I really felt the need to kind of help them out. I was really starting to focus on, getting ships over there, trying to build up a large Pacific fleet to kind of deal with the SUF and make sure they're not able to invade any further into North America. Get ships up to the Alaska region to ensure that no other units could get across to Alaska. So while I really wanted to focus on that, I knew that this conflict with the EU had to happen sooner rather than later. I couldn't wait for them to build up, for them to be prepared for conflict with me. I thought it was the best if we just attacked them early before they were ready and just get them wiped out, get this front dealt with. So this would be myself and Angola. They were going to be primarily invading the European Union. So the plan was, Angola had always had a conflict with Greece. Greece had from very early on been speaking out against Angola and the threat that he posed back when he was still conquering Africa. Greece was very vocal. He had been trying to build up a coalition against the Legion, which I think is why he might have joined the EU, because it was the closest thing to a coalition in Europe that would perhaps be able to oppose us. And so Angola had always kind of had a personal vendetta against Greece and had always wanted to take him out. Very early he had wanted to do that. And the South America thing was something he actually didn't want to do initially. He wanted to attack Greece much earlier, but we had discussed it, and at this point Goya still seemed like the greatest threat. And so I felt like it would be good if all three of us, HiJynx, myself, and Angola, all attacked South America at the same time to get Goyas wiped out and to get that region dealt with. Now, of course, that didn't end up being the case because Goyas did go inactive. But at that point, we did think that he was the greatest threat, so that did allow Greece to live a little bit longer than he would have if Angola had his way, because, again, he did want to invade pretty early. Pretty much as soon as he had this territory in his hand, he wanted to go after Greece. So the plan was for him to invade Greece, and then for me to attack Poland, Sweden, and Italy. Now, we already knew at this point that Italy was most likely inactive, with all his troops over here at Palermo. So I wasn't too worried about the Italians. I expected, since the AI hadn't taken over, that there's probably no units throughout all of his territory, which ended up being the case. I was able to just move through there and take over most of Italy without any opposition, since he did move his whole army over here to Sicily. And so basically it was going to be a 2v1, 2 versus 1 between me, Poland, and Sweden. Poland and Sweden were going to be able to gang up on me and fight me and outnumber me. I knew their sizes, the general sizes of their military. I had moved submarines up along the German and Danish coast here, so I had a good idea how much troops and the composition of his army that Sweden had, at least on my borders. I was a little bit surprised that he had more units than I had seen here. He had a fairly large army that came a little bit later in the conflict that I wasn't expecting, but I kind of had a good view of what he was rocking, what his units he had, and the sizes of his army. Poland, on the other hand, I knew exactly what he had because there was another country over here, and that's the country of Volga Nizhny. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But he was not in the EU, but he's friendly with them. But I had contacted him about an agreement where we would allow him to stay alive and even conquer territory in through Central Asia here, because I didn't see any reason why he couldn't have that territory. We didn't need all this territory in order to win the game. And so I had made an agreement with him, as well as with Persia down here in the Middle East. So at this point, there was a coalition here called the Pact of Oil and Steel or something like that, Steel and Oil Pact. I don't know exactly what they're called, but there's a coalition here between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Persia. And so I had been in contact with Persia fairly early on, and we had decided to kind of work together. It became like another secret ally of the Legion. So I had told him that he would be able to, stay alive in the game and conquer territory here in Asia if he joined a secret alliance with us. And the only thing I really required of him was that he kick Egypt out of their coalition, because Egypt, like Greece, was another country that very early on was speaking out against Angola very publicly, and Angola felt the need to get revenge on him, as well as the fact that Angola very much wanted control of the entire African continent. And so he'd have to, of course, get Egypt knocked out for that. So we had made an agreement that had really only two things that we required of their coalition. The first was to kick Egypt out so that we can destroy them without having to worry about these guys attacking us later. And two, Saudi Arabia had one province here in Africa. And so we required that Saudi Arabia trade that province to Angola for the other side of the Suez Canal. So he could have this one province here, which was good for us because it's easily defensible territory in case this coalition did decide, Saudi Arabia or Persia or whatever, they decided to betray us and they wanted to attack, they'd have to cross the Suez Canal, which is, a little bit difficult to do because it does take so long for transport ships to embark and disembark. It's about 4.5 hours each. So, you're looking at like 9 hours plus any time in the sea to get to where you need to embark and disembark. So maybe 10 hours total for them to get from here to here, at least. So very good defensible terrain here for both sides, for their side and our side. So it felt like a good point for us to kind of draw our borders. So it's kind of difficult to get Saudi Arabia to do that agreement, and he was kind of a little bit rude about it. A little bit rude to me, but more so to Angola. Very rude about it overall. Like he wasn't exactly, like he didn't exactly agree to it. It was more Persia that was our primary contact with this coalition, and he was very easy to work with, and he actually had agreed to attack Syria and Iraq, who, from my understanding, were opposed to working with the Legion, that him and Saudi Arabia would conquer them too. And that's exactly what they did. I think it was mostly Saudi Arabia who'd conquered the territory. You'll see that Iraq now still has territory here at the end because they never did finish that before some other things ended up developing. But they did attack Iraq and Syria, kicked them out of the coalition, and started conquering their territory here. And so, along with Persia, who was going to have the agreement to conquer this territory here in Asia, we also had done the same agreement with Volga Nizhny. And they were going to conquer, they're going to get part of the territory here in Central Asia and be allowed to exist until the end of the game, which you can see they do exist still. He is still around here. In fact, he was in the middle of a conflict with an AI country here in Kazakhstan when the game ended. And he had map share with Poland, so he could see every unit that Poland had and where they were at. So I had that advantage that he was, contacting me and telling me where the Polish units were. Now, intel is incredibly important, knowing what the enemy has and where their units are at. But I would say that overall, while it was helpful, it wasn't like a game changer, me being able to see where the units were. Because of the way my strategy was, it was very defensive, so I didn't really need to know, for the most part, where his units were. It did help knowing what the composition was, because if I didn't know it, I might not have started the conflict with them when I did. But overall, I'd say that the intel, because I played so defensively against these two, probably wasn't as helpful as it would have been if I was on the offensive. But knowing the composition was important. I was able to see the weaknesses of both Sweden and Poland, and it was that knowledge that allowed me to feel very confident that I could take them both on together and prevail without help from Angola, because he was not going to be able to help out for a while. Obviously, he'd have to, I think when we declared war, he had his troops already on transport ships, but they still had to sail across to Greece, which I thought he would have already done that before he declared war, but I think he was worried about Greece seeing his units, and so he didn't. So I had to wait that time. Then I had to wait for him to actually get the troops, disembarked onto the land here. Now, he did use paratroopers to take several of his cities. However, paratroopers do take a long time to organize themselves after they drop. I don't know how long it is, but it's like a really long time. So they pretty much just drop and take, the territory, and then they don't really do much after that for a little while. I think it might be good, I don't want to put any numbers out there, but maybe like 24 hours or something like that. It's a long time for the paratroopers to kind of organize themselves after they drop. But he did use the paratroopers here. But other than those, it was mostly waiting quite a while for him to get over here and help out, just because of how long it takes to disembark and then get troops through this territory here. So it was going to be me against the Polish and Swedish for quite a while before I got any assistance. And so I knew that. And the reason why I felt confident I could take him is because I did know the composition of the militaries. And in the case of Sweden, he had a lot of self-propelled artillery. So I knew that it wasn't going to be a game of me just being able to bombard him easily and not take casualties myself. However, his one weakness of his military was the fact that he had no AA, not one unit of AA. And he also didn't have an air force, meaning that I was going to be able to completely control the skies and bombard his army the entire time we were fighting. So that's why I felt very confident, despite his large number of artillery and his very large number of tanks, that I could take out the Swedish. As for Poland, Poland had a couple AA. He had a few, but not much. Not enough for the size of his army. So I knew I'd be able to use my planes against him, though they'd probably take some casualties. But what he didn't have was artillery. I don't think he had any artillery, maybe one or two. His large army had, I think his large army did have like 2 or 3 artillery pieces. But they were the slow artillery, the towed artillery. So I knew I would just be able to bombard his units, not just with my air force, but with my artillery would be able to easily bombard his forces without really having to worry about too much retaliation, because he just didn't have enough artillery to take me on. So despite the fact that really I'd say my European army was probably about equal to one of their armies for the most part. I'd say probably about equal to just one. And that's everything I had in Europe. Was only equal to one of their forces. So I knew I was going to be outnumbered 2-1, and that's not even considering the fact that I did have to send, about 3 units into Italy to try and get that territory conquered, because I was a little bit worried about Italy going under AI control while we were at war. So I wanted to get the territory wrapped up as quickly as possible before the AI took over and started building units into cities. So I was pretty worried about that. So I sent 3 units into Italy. So when you subtract those 3 units, I was easily outnumbered, probably more than 2-1 when fighting these guys. But I started the conflict because, again, I knew the composition of their armies. I felt confident I could take them out with the strategy I was going to use. And so what the strategy was to build fortifications and then to slowly back up into those fortifications as I bombarded the enemy units with my artillery, the combined force of my artillery and my aircraft. So I built fortifications throughout this territory here, from Dusseldorf all the way down to Nuremberg. So I had fortifications all along here and multiple fortifications so that I could slowly retreat back. And I did have the fortifications still building. Many of them weren't done yet, but they still provide a little bit of their modifier if you've gotten them constructed up to a point, which I did. So the fact that they weren't done building was important because I was able to delete those as I pulled back, so they didn't even help the enemy, though I think they probably would have got destroyed anyways when he took over. But I was able to get some of my resources back because I would just delete them once I decided to abandon a territory. So we declared war on Sweden, Poland, Italy, and Greece all at the same time. Italy wasn't really active at that point. The AI hadn't taken control, so it was just sending units in. Greece was also inactive at that point, but we did not know that when we invaded, but apparently they were inactive too. So again, his units weren't really being controlled, though the game will, artillery will still fire back, units will still fight back if you attack them in melee. So it's not like you don't have to fight the units, it's just easier when nobody's actually controlling them and giving them orders. So Greece was inactive as well, so it was really just Poland and Sweden. Ukraine was active, but we specifically said that we didn't declare war on him yet anyways, so that we're really just trying to focus on these the initial 4 countries here. So I'd mentioned in a couple other videos after this had happened that I'd spent a lot of time on this conflict here. This was the conflict I was talking about. I spent, oh good God, I don't know how many hours, a lot, like 8 hours straight, I know, just controlling my units, being very, very active in this conflict. But even more than that overall, you know, it being a little bit less active, probably over the course of maybe 14 hours or so. I spent a lot of time on that day. And some of that day I was at work for a big chunk of the day actually, and I was playing from work. Don't tell my boss, but I do have the game on my computer at work, so I was able to play it from there. Just trying to be as active as I possibly could given the circumstances. Probably not the best day for me to declare war, but it just kind of fit with our timetable with me and Angola. So as soon as I declared war, they both were active. They both started their invasions immediately. They were much quicker to react than I was expecting. The Swedish started pushing forward. They brought their artillery in. Unfortunately, he had a destroyer here by my battleship fleet in the Netherlands, there that was off the coast of the Netherlands, that had to destroy first. So that was distracting the battleship fleet from coming over here and bombarding his units like I had initially thought they would be able to. But instead they had to sink that destroyer. And then on top of that, the Swedish then brought another fleet, a cruiser fleet, down with several destroyers. So I think it was just one cruiser. It could have been two. I'm not entirely sure. I don't remember. But they did have several destroyers. I think it was 5 ships total, 4 or 5 ships total that had to fight there. And the battleship fleet had to deal with that as well. So it just really distracted my fleet from being able to help out in the ground conflict, which I was expecting their assistance. By the time they got over here, I think they only bombarded like one artillery unit, one self-propelled artillery unit that was kind of moving by them. They hit them one time. So overall, the fleet was not very helpful in the initial start of this conflict, which I expected to have their assistance. So that was the first kind of negative here in the conflict. Also, the quick reaction of both Sweden and Poland. They reacted very quickly. So Sweden started pushing forward. And our artillery started bombarding each other. So my main army here against Sweden was in Osnabrück. I might be completely mispronouncing that, some terrible German words. But our army was here, and he was invading from Bremen. And our artillery was kind of bombarding each other initially. Now I had that fortification bonus, so therefore I took a lot less damage than he did. So that was kind of the first advantage that I had. And then the second one was that he split his tank army, which, by the way, was not split from his slow units like infantry and anti-tanks. He didn't split those. He just split all of his kind of melee units, is what we call them, what they call them here in the game. He split all the melee units, the ones that got to engage close up and attack the army, from the range units, the self-propelled artillery units. And that was actually not a good move because that allowed my artillery to focus fire on his artillery. We talked about this last episode when I think Ontario did the exact same thing. And what ends up happening is that my army, when his artillery fires on it, all the damage is kind of mitigated by the other units that are with the artillery. It gets spread out across all those units. While his artillery, which is now alone, has to take all of the damage that my artillery fires on him, resulting on his artillery taking far more damage than mine does, and gives me a significant advantage. In addition, he moved those tanks, which he vastly outnumbered me with his main army. Because again, my army had to be split to deal with both him and Poland, and because it was defensive, I needed to defend all of my provinces. Unlike them, they were on the offense, and so they could put their entire army together. And that's exactly what Poland and Sweden did. So they both charged at me with 2 very large armies. And so I was at a severe disadvantage in numbers throughout the entire conflict. So in that melee battle, he could have easily won, but he wasn't able to engage me because, again, I had very fast units, while he had fast units as well, but that were slowed down by the slow units. He never split them off. He cut them all together, resulting in them moving at the speed of the slowest unit, which I think was the anti-tank he had in there, perhaps, that or the infantry. So they moved at a very slow speed. And I did have some towed artillery, I think, here against Sweden. But what I did is I just, I split them off, which again, you don't want to do when fighting artillery. But at this point, they were not our fighting artillery. They were. I kept the self-propelled artillery fighting his self-propelled artillery, while my towed artillery was bombarding his melee units that were charging at me. And then what I did is I just kind of slowly pulled them back. They fire every hour. So I would tell them to move back exactly, 59 minutes or so, so that as soon as they stopped, they would then fire, and then I'd move them back again another hour worth. So the towed units were constantly, retreating. because they were slow, so I wanted to make sure they didn't get caught in a melee battle. While my fast units, kind of stood there longer in the forts, being able to take the damage with the defensive bonus, meaning that they're taking less damage, and then they slowly retreated as well right before the melee units got to them. And so that was my tactic. It worked very, very well here against Sweden. I killed a very large number of troops without taking very many casualties myself initially. So I did have to retreat from Osnabrück and into Dusseldorf, where again I had fortifications there as well. He never attacked my units here in Castle, so those ones, and again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these, but those units were able to initially help against Sweden and bombard those Swedish forces, kind of helped me out here, just because, again, we were quite outnumbered. And things were going great. I focused my air power all on the Swedish forces because, again, he didn't have any AA, so I felt like that was the best location for him. Eventually, between the artillery fire and my tactical bombers, I was able to get all of his artillery completely destroyed. So now he just had a melee unit, which was just kind of chasing down my units, taking hits from both my artillery and my tactical bombers the entire time that they were moving. And again, they were moving incredibly slow because he never split off the fast units from the slow units. So he's just letting them take damage that entire time, taking massive casualties. And everything was going great, and I thought I had an easy win here. His army was just about destroyed, and then another army came out of nowhere of like, I don't know, remember how many units, it was 6 or 7 units of tank units. So as I saw this big old tank army, which it doesn't seem big, but compared to the numbers I had here, that was a lot of units. And so I saw this tank army here when I thought I had already won against Sweden, and so I was a little bit like, oh, okay, this is not going to be as quick a victory against the Swedes as I thought it was going to be. And eventually I did know that I needed to put up a defense here. I needed to engage his units in melee, because once he got past Dusseldorf, it'd be really hard to kind of stop him. I had fortifications here in Frankfurt, but you don't actually have to attack Frankfurt to then attack Luxembourg. Again, I had fortifications there as well, with a couple units defending it. But it really becomes kind of wide open, where he has many different provinces he could attack now, and of course he could go into Cologne as well. So overall, I really didn't want him to get through here if I could stop him. So I did decide to let my units attack or defend here, because they would be on, first they'd get the defensive bonus. Almost all units, with a few exceptions, do better on the defense than attacking. So I would get the defensive bonuses, and then on top of that, because they were going to be inside of a fortification, they would get those defensive bonuses as well. So I felt like it was a good time, despite being vastly outnumbered, to put up a defense here. And while they were fighting in melee with his larger force, which those 6 or 7 tank units joined with what remained of his larger army. And that's where we engaged each other. And that whole entire time I was able to bombard him with both, my Air Force and my artillery. Had some artillery units. I think the anti-air was here in Frankfurt along the borders here bombarding, while the slower ones were here in Cologne bombarding. And eventually he did end up winning that battle. Again, I think I only had a couple units defending there, because I just didn't have a ton of units that could do melee battle, tanks and infantry and stuff like that. It was just like a couple tank units and like a mechanized infantry. There wasn't much, because that just wasn't really my tactic for this conflict. So he did win, but with barely any units. Most of his army was destroyed by that point. And then he sent those tanks, the remainder tanks, into Cologne against an infantry, and I think there was a militia unit, which I don't build militia units, but France had built one in one of his provinces, and after I conquered it, then I got his militia unit. So it was just an infantry and militia unit, so he attacked knowing that the couple tanks that he had, were far better than those 2 units. But clearly he didn't know that in the cities, those tanks get a 50% modifier, so they were not better than the infantry and militia unit, so they did die in Cologne, the last little remainder of the Swedish army, and that's all he had at that point. And Sweden was done for. That's pretty much everything he had. I think he sent a message in the newspaper soon after saying, "Hey, you've won. My units are dead, and I expect you to quickly conquer all my territory." So that was the war against Sweden. Went Pretty smooth. Again, we did take some casualties for the most part. It was very good kill death ratio though. I mean, I killed in the end of the war. I think I'd killed like, in the end of the war here in Germany, I should say. I think I killed like 30,000 while only losing like 3,000 of my own. So overall, very, very good numbers. So while the war against Sweden was happening, at the same time I was defending against Poland. The conflict against Poland developed a little bit differently. More than anything, probably because I didn't have my Air Force over here helping. So maybe I should have moved them over here to help out a bit, especially once Sweden was just about done for. But I don't think I moved them over here quick enough. So the war over here was a little bit more difficult. And we'll kind of go over exactly what happened here. So my defenses were set up here in Erfurt. Again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing anything. While they were in Leipzig. And he initially had a couple units here on the border between our provinces. I was able to quickly take those out. It was like 3 to 4 units or something like that. However, he had a much larger army that then came down from the north here, I think in Hanover. Very large army that began moving down. Now they actually had artillery, but he never stopped them to let the artillery fire, so they're just constantly moving forward. Now again, while he had fast units, had tanks in that army, he never split them off, so they were always moving at the speed of the slowest unit. They did have anti-air support, I think, so I think if I had bombarded them, I would have took a little bit of casualties, but overall it wasn't. I think I only had 1 or 2 AA units in that large army. The majority of them were tanks, infantry, and a few anti-tanks as well. Again, I was going to use the same strategy against Poland that I used so successfully against Sweden. You know, slowly kind of backing up on my forts, bombarding them from the forts, and just not engaging them if I can avoid it, unless it's at a point where it feels like it's a good place to engage. So I was completely planning on giving up Erfurt just as I gave up Osnabrück and retreating into Nuremberg and Wurzburg. So that was the plan. But things didn't go exactly as I had hoped. Unfortunately, I mean, everything was going great. And unfortunately, I don't know if it was on my end or, if it was a bug. I don't know that it was a bug. It might have been on my end, like I had lost connection or something. And I was clicking around trying to get control again. And so I might have, while trying to click around, I might have accidentally given some units some orders that I didn't want to do. And then I had to leave the game and then come back in. It was a couple precious moments, just a few minutes. But when I came back in, there's some serious issues. My army that was here at Erfurt had been split. I had split it formally. I had split them for the artillery and the slow units to start retreating, while leaving the faster units sitting here in Erfurt. Again, I wasn't planning on leaving them there. But they had left the fort and had attacked that large Polish army. 3 units, just 3 units. But again, that's all I really had. It was just a few units to use for this purpose, that weren't ranged units. And that's what I had here on this side. That was it. And so those 3 units had left the fort and attacked that large Polish army where they had no chance. If I had decided to fight them, I would have stayed in the fort, so I got the defensive bonus. But not only were they not getting the defensive bonus, but they had attacked the Polish army, which, as I said, the stats for most units are worse here on the attack than on the defense. So really terrible issue. I can't explain exactly how it happened. I don't know, but it was bad. So I lost those 3 units, and really all I had. I did have some troops defending Kassel, but the troops that were here were supposed to retreat to Wurzburg and Nuremberg, and I'll discuss what was going on with the Nuremberg units, but essentially those ones needed to come back here to defend Wurzburg, where my air base was. That's where my planes were operating out of, and also this is where my railroad gun was here. I should mention I had railroad guns in this conflict. One focused on the Swedish forces and one focused on the Polish forces, and I had that advantage as well over him. He did not have railroad guns. Railroad guns are great because they do good damage, but more importantly, they have very, very long range. I think they had the longest range of any ranged unit. Now, of course, planes have longer range, but as far as like land-based or naval-based, ranged units, the railroad guns have the longest range of all of them. So I had that advantage where I could fire on him and he can't fire on me, and I could keep him far back. And I was always slowly retreating those, again, using that same tactic. Again, just move them back, tell them to retreat for 50-something minutes, so as soon as they're done, they'll fire, and then I can move them back again in another hour or so. So I was using that tactic very effectively, but yeah, my railroader gun was positioned here, and just it was wide open. I was incredibly concerned because it was just ranged units at this point, and they were looking at a 20, or I mean at that point he had lost a lot of units. But I'd say he still had maybe like 14 units or so that he was going to be able to, invade into territory that was really just defended by range units. So I was quite concerned at that point because of whatever had happened here, which just kind of ruined my strategy. So I did use a little bit of gold, not much. I think it was like maybe 3,000 to 4,000 gold to pump out one unit here in Paris, so I could start moving them over there. And then I also used gold to get a couple air bases quickly built in the hope that Angola would be able to start getting his air force up here to help me, because he had by that point landed in Greece and he had a couple air bases, but he did not have the range to get planes up here. So I did gold in an air base, I think right here. I'm gonna say I built another air base, maybe somewhere over here to kind of get planes moving over here quicker or something like that. So mainly spent the gold on air bases to get those built quicker, and then one unit. So that's what I spent that on. I did take Angola 4.5 hours, I think, from the point that I golded that air base in to get his planes actually up here. So I was facing Poland's very large army with really no defenders for several hours before Angola was able to get his air force over here to assist. Luckily, I was able to largely take out most of his force by then. I knew that the Sweden was done for, so the force that was here in Kessel that was helping out there was able to come down here and start bombarding the Polish army. Also, he had lost down here in his offensive against Nuremberg, which is one thing I hadn't mentioned yet. He had sent a light tank. All this territory around Prague was under the control of the Italians, so therefore I couldn't see into there. And Poland had sent an army down that way, and I saw that they were sending an army there. And Vogonishny eventually sent me a warning about the units that were there and what was coming, but at that point I'd already sent one of my interceptors to patrol over here just to scout and see what he had here. And originally he was sending a fairly large force down here into Pilsen to then invade into my territory back here and go after Munich. And he should have sent that entire force down there, because I don't know that I could have stopped such a large force, flanking me. I eventually would have dealt with it as he got back into this territory. I'd already planned for that possibility, but initially he would have had a lot of success here. But instead he decided to not do that, and then even though he had a large army coming down to Pilsen, he then split it up and sent the majority of the army back north and only sent one light tank down here, maybe to probe this area, kind of see my reaction here. And I initially went after Nuremberg. I had a light tank there with a self-propelled artillery bombarding him. When he realized he was going to get bombarded all the way to Nuremberg, he decided to go back to Pilsen. I followed him, bombarding him the entire way. And then he decided to go after this province here in Rosenheim instead. Now I did have some commandos that were going through the provinces, the mountain provinces here that the Italians were occupying. So the commando unit I had there in Salzburg went to Rosenheim and helped out the light tank that was there to defend the territory from his light tank that was already fairly damaged from my artillery fire. And that was it. That's all he sent down here, and I easily took care of it. And he really should have sent more troops this way into the Italian territory and taken advantage of this, but he didn't. But instead he decided to send his entire army in one direction into one province, and big mistake on his part. So in addition to that initial 20 units here, I want to say I had and then the ones that I quickly destroyed here, I want to say about maybe 15 other units, kind of came together and started invading here. And of all those units, what was left by the time Angola got here was about 10. So yeah, by the time Angola got here, Poland only had a very small fraction of his army, and I could have eventually destroyed them on my own without Angola's help by then. I was really worried initially, which is why I golded those air bases. But by the time he got here, those 4.5 hours it took him to get here, I had pretty much wiped out majority of his army. And I would have had to retreat though, because again, he did outnumber me, and those were melee units, and I didn't have any to really fight him. So I would have had to continue to retreat and bombard him with my air force and my artillery. I would have had to continue to retreat, and I probably lost a couple provinces if Angola hadn't come here. But Angola did arrive and finished up those remaining units that were already, again, pretty damaged. There's only about 10 of them, and they were all pretty low health at that point. So he allowed me to not have to retreat. So that was helpful, having Angola arrive here. Just allowed me to not have to give up any more territory. And then from there, I had already sent tanks, light tanks in to go take all of his key cities. I knew which ones were defended, again, because of having the intel from our little mole here. And so I knew exactly which cities were defended and which ones weren't. So like I knew, for instance, in this city that there was a unit defending there, and so I didn't want to send my light tank there, while I knew that Warsaw, the capital, was completely undefended. So I was able to send a light tank in. And so I'd say that that was where the intel was most helpful, was when I was sending, fast units back behind his territory to try and gain up all his cities so that he wouldn't be able to, take over all his cities, so he wouldn't be able to build more units there that I'd have to fight later. I figured I'd just get these cities knocked out. And so it was really helpful to know which ones were defended and which ones weren't. So I'd say that's where the intel was most helpful. Not so much here when I was doing the main war on the defense. So I had those fast units coming over here, taking out those cities. He kept pumping units, pulling units out of his cities that were defending and pumping them to the front, which, again, by that point, Angola and myself had our planes overhead, destroying every single unit he sent over here. So overall, the conflict was over by that point, and so it was just a matter of taking over all of this territory. Angola had invaded and taken over all Greece. By then I had taken over Italy and had taken over this former Yugoslavian territory. And as far as Romania goes, I think Angola wasn't attacking into Polish territory, because Poland did have control of all of Romania here. And I think he wasn't attacking into there just out of respect for the fact that I had defeated Poland. And to kind of let me get more territory or whatever. But so I had said, go ahead and take over some of this Romanian territory. This would allow him to get a border on Ukraine as well, which he would shortly declare war on and invade into Ukraine. Ukraine at that time had invaded Persia. So the SUF had declared war on Persia. They kind of knew that we were working, they thought we were working with Saudi Arabia. But I think the province exchange might have tipped them off on that. So they had decided to invade into Persia, which Persia had all this territory here, and they were attacking Persia. Sichuan was attacking them over here, and then Ukraine also then invaded into Persian territory and was having a lot of success. Persia then had wrote a newspaper post saying that he was quitting because he was being invaded from all sides, and so Ukraine was busy over here fighting Persia and was just not able to defend his territory when Angola came and invaded him. I think he really thought he was safe because of that newspaper post, and he had no intentions, which we were surprised with, because we thought, despite us giving him the chance to stay out of the war, we thought he would help his allies. He would help Poland out in the conflict, send troops over here, but he didn't. He decided to go get himself all bogged down in Turkey against another coalition, when he should have been worried about the coalition that was on his doorstep. So his territory was not well defended. And Angola had a lot of success here. Quickly conquered Ukraine, wasn't too difficult to fight, really. So he worked on that while I was taking over all of the territory that Poland and Sweden had, which was quite a bit. There was a lot of territory. Sweden had a couple units that were still left. He was retreating them over here. But then he started sending troops again across the Baltic to go back into Germany. I don't know why he did that. He sent them one at a time, and by that point my submarine was here and able to act on it, and I was able to sink several of his troops that tried to get across the Baltic. And at that point I didn't see any Swedish forces for a long time. So Sweden did have control of Denmark, so I conquered that. But then after that, I decided on not doing a naval invasion initially across here, because I didn't know what Sweden had. I didn't know if he was going to start building planes. I didn't know if he had submarines here. My battleship fleet was slowly making its way into the Baltic to escort ships across, but that was going to take time. So instead of invading across here, I set troops up to do it, but I didn't do it initially. I didn't do it actually until I had made a lot of progress through Polish and Swedish territory through the rest of Europe. So I quickly conquered all the Polish territory. Again, I say quickly, but it takes a long time to move your units through all this. So it took a lot of time to conquer all of the Polish territory. He was continuing to build units the entire time, so I had to fight those as I went. but I never was able to put together a large force again. So it was just kind of like using my artillery to take out the units that were built in the city. Then from there, I stopped right here in Onega, maybe. Again, sorry about my piss poor pronunciation. But I stopped here, built up a defensive force here, and they controlled all this territory up here, up to like Inta and down here. I think it was right along here was their front. And so I had decided not to conquer that way just yet, because that would put me on the borders with the SUF. And instead, to wrap up the rest of the Swedish territory, kind of just put a defensive force here for if he did attack me, which he didn't. And then I invaded into Finland, and then from there into Sweden and Norway. By that point, I then had also sent an invasion across the Baltic, and it invaded across here as well, and started getting all this territory wrapped up in Scandinavia. And I never found a single unit here. There wasn't a single unit defending in Scandinavia, because Sweden had decided to move his entire army over here. Now, I believe it was fairly small initially, but I guess he had continued building units, or what, I don't know what the deal was, but eventually it was, I think, about 23 units that I found in Inta. So I had brought my forces, started moving east, and, again, there wasn't no forces until I got to Inta, and then I had to fight those. There was about 23 Swedish units here, and they were also in a fortified mountain province, so it was still pretty easy, because, again, he just didn't have the artillery needed to really fire back. He had a couple artillery. I was able to use my planes on him as well, because I don't think he still didn't have any anti-air to defend against that. So overall, pretty low casualties in that conflict. But I was surprised to find such a large Swedish force there. Just kind of conquered east. Now, this whole process did take quite a while. Again, the war against the European Union started, I think, on day 16. We invaded Germany on day 15, and the war with them started on day 16. And that was the big day where most of the conflict happened. But then, to the point where I finished Sweden up, I think it was like day 20 is when I finally finished him up. So it was several days of getting all this territory conquered. Took a long time to get it all wrapped up. So I was very much focused on that, while again Angola, was focused on Ukraine, and then going into the Middle East, where he then declared war on Saudi Arabia. Again, he had always planned on doing it because of how rude he was to us. So he definitely wanted to conquer Saudi Arabia. So he had done that, and then that created the situation where both Angola and myself were now finally on borders with the SUF. Again, we're talking about day 20, day 21, something like that. So pretty close to the end of the conflict here. And that's how long it took us to get to the SUF on that side. So the whole entire time that we were all focused on Europe, the rest of our coalition was fighting the SUF and their allies. So over here in the Pacific, remember the war with the SUF started on day 14. Throughout day 15 and day 16, really it was just communist Chinese submarines sinking British Columbia's cruisers. Again, there was a little bit of conflict here in Alaska, but more than anything, it was both sides trying to conquer the AI that was here more than engaging each other. So it was really just conquering this AI territory. British Columbia reacted very quickly to the war with the SUF to try and get all of the AI territory up here in the north conquered. And so he was taking care of all of that. But in the Pacific, it was really just Communist China's submarines, which he did have pretty high-level submarines, just sinking British Columbia's unescorted cruisers. And it was just devastating. He took massive casualties from the overall conflict. His force in Japan, he did send those convoys back to Japan, and I think he invaded into this island right here, successfully took it. But the SUF quickly eradicated his forces that were here. But again, I think he only had like 2 units here at that point, like some artillery units or something like that. And his cruisers just crossed the Pacific, which again, he did have several cruisers. He had a lot of cruisers, and they were just getting sunk left and right from the communist Chinese submarines, because again, he just didn't have them escorted, so they took very, very high casualties. But other than that, not much was going on over here. And on day 16 is when the SUF struck. So if you recall, day 16 was the day that we invaded the European Union. Both me and Angola were highly active throughout the day and at night. And I don't know, Angola's always very active, so he might have seen this regardless. But the fact that he was very active that night did result in him catching the SUF with a very large invasion force here in the Indian Ocean and up along his borders too. And it was, I believe all the forces were from Sichuan and from South India. So Sichuan had many convoy troops, large number of convoy troops that he was planning on invading Africa with. While South India also had troops, but more than anything, I think he was the Navy. He had his carrier fleet here, which he had a ton of naval bombers. Again, they had spent a lot of their technology research time on the Navy. So our Communist China had very high-level submarines. South India had very high-level carriers. So he was able to have a lot of planes on those carriers. So he had all his naval bombers out here patrolling the Indian Ocean. And it was a very large invasion force. Now, they tried to spread some propaganda about that they weren't going into Africa, that they were going into Madagascar instead. Now, we knew that was untrue because, of course, why would you have convoys up here along the African coast if you're going to invade Madagascar? And they were saying, oh, we weren't going to invade Africa. Of course, Madagascar is part of Africa, so even if you were invading here, you were invading Africa. But I did find out later for sure, not that we didn't know this anyways, but did find out later for sure, which we'll discuss that later in the video, that they were most definitely planning on invading Angola. But they weren't planning on doing it yet. They weren't ready when Angola found their ships out here. And Angola did not have the force to deal with them. So he was in the newspaper, giving them warning after warning to get their forces back to India, and that he was gonna, sink those convoys that were out there and attack the fleet that was out here. He had a lot of submarines here, but just not enough to really deal with as a large of a force the SUF had brought over here. And so I had told him, privately, I was like, and I'd also said in my own little newspaper post that I felt that we should just attack them, that this was a clear act of aggression, that we were already at war with the SUF, so therefore, there's no point on making peace. We're not at peace with them, though technically Angola had never actually joined the war yet. And so I was saying he just needed to attack them. But he was concerned about the fact that, one, he didn't have enough troops over here defending the territory yet, so he was bringing a lot more troops over here. But more than anything, that he just didn't have the naval force to deal with how many troops they had brought here, and just how large their navy was as well. The fleet was significant, so he was quite concerned about it. And so he was trying to avoid fighting them initially, but then it became very clear that they were not going to stop. And that's what I told him. They spent all this time planning this invasion. How long did it take to get this planned, to get all those troops across the Indian Ocean secretly, without being seen? There's just so much time it took to get them over here that there was no way that they're turning around, just because he had seen them. Eventually, he had come to that same conclusion and did attack them. And he started just building up a massive fleet, because at that point he really just had submarines. Angola had told me that he didn't typically play with large capital ship fleets very often. Typically just uses big old huge submarine fleets. So he started building up very large capital ship fleets with cruisers and battleships and destroyers and carriers. So we built up a very large military here to kind of eventually destroy them all. And he was successful eventually. He did take some losses, of course, but overall it went very well for him. He sunk all their transports that were up along the coast here. South India eventually retreated. He lost a ton of his planes over here, and he eventually retreated with his carriers. And I want to say that I know that South India had gotten several troops away. They did invade into Madagascar here. As you can see, South India still has that province here. They eventually did land some troops there, which I think his capital ship fleet did eventually destroy them. I think the AI also did a large part of that, because you see Madagascar's got a fairly large force here. They're looking pretty strong, so I think they actually lost most of their units from the AI here. They landed some of their troops there, trying to get them out of the sea so they didn't get sunk. And he also retreated with a large chunk of his force as well. But eventually the invasion was completely pushed back. But that was major, because I think that this was big. This was real big for them to try and get Angola knocked out of the conflict, get onto his home territory, and just start causing him problems over here. But yeah, the invasion was not successful. But remember, we were doing that at the same time I should say Angola was doing that because nobody else was really helping him in that. He was dealing with that at the same time that he was invading into Greece and Ukraine. So he had to fight both of those simultaneously, this naval conflict against the SUF and the land conflict against the European Union. Another thing that should be mentioned with the conflict here that Angola was involved with was that Italy was eventually taken over by the AI. I think it was like a day after. I think it was the day right after we started our war with them, so day 17. The AI took over for the Italians, and they immediately started bringing their troops back to Italy, which I was not prepared for. I did not have any troops over here, so I had to start bringing some units to try and deal with it, but I was hoping that the Angolan submarine fleet would take care of them, and that was the plan. It was going to sink them all as soon as they went into the sea. Unfortunately, something weird happened with the UK. So the UK had his battleship fleet over here, and he was supposed to also help deal with any convoys that went into the sea. By this point, he had clearly gone inactive. However, for some reason, and I don't know what exactly happened here, right after Angola started attacking the convoys, the Italian convoys as they entered the sea, the UK battleship fleet attacked Angola, attacked his submarines, which he does have 8 level 5 destroyers here, so they were able to, they could do significant damage to his submarines. And so he had to retreat, and that caused some serious issues, and I don't know what happened with the UK there. The only thing we could really think of is that he had to, I don't know, he had to have come back in the game just briefly and gave the order to attack or something. Another possibility is that he had his unit set to attack like even neutral units, perhaps, although I don't know why they wouldn't have already started to attack the Italian units, so probably not. I don't know. I really don't know how he could have ended up attacking them without giving the order. Maybe he did it on accident. Maybe he came in real quick and saw the Italian convoys and then meant to click on them. And meant to give the order to attack the Italian convoys and accidentally clicked on Angola's submarine and attacked him instead. I don't really know, but that ended up happening, and that resulted in Italians landing in southern Italy, and I had to deal with that. I had to bring troops down here to deal with those AI Italian units that came down here. And they did take several provinces from me before I was able to get control of the situation. But eventually we got them all destroyed. Did take a bit of time, but eventually we got them all wrapped up, and I came over here and conquered Palermo and took Sicily from them. So that's pretty much it for our war against the European Union. And now I really want to concentrate on the war in the Pacific and everything that happened over here. So as I mentioned, we had an alliance with the Emu Empire, and I thought that they would help us in the Pacific here, sinking SUF ships, specifically those communist Chinese submarines that were causing British Columbia all kinds of issues. But then they made peace with the SUF because, interestingly enough, the SUF, as soon as they attacked us, that same day, they declared war on the Emu Empire and then invaded over here, took like a province from them or whatever. And so, I figured that this was like the SUF, like this is them doing everything at once. Like they're going to start conflict with us on the same time that they're going to start conflict with the Emu Empire. This is like a power move, trying to get control of Indochina here. And so that's why I had contacted the Emu Empire about the alliance. And so the idea here was that, while I did not have enough ships here in the Pacific, we didn't really have much of anything in the Pacific. Texas, HiJynx, she just had some destroyers, and I think they were all over here in the Gulf. Kentucky didn't really have much of a fleet at the time. He had a couple of ships again that were in the Gulf. We talked about British Columbia's fleet, submarines and cruisers, but they didn't do so well over here. And I didn't really have anything at that point at the beginning of the conflict with the SUF. So the plan here was for the Emu Empire to do the naval game here in the Pacific, to deal with the SUF, make sure that they weren't able to bring troops to attack us on our Pacific coast, to deal with those communist Chinese submarines. So that was what I was thinking was going to happen. However, things got strange. So the Emu Empire, they're at war here, and we noticed that there wasn't much province exchanges. The Emu Empire gained a couple provinces. Sichuan gained a couple provinces because they were at the time along this border here in Indochina. But that was it. There was very, very low casualties, and then they made peace almost immediately. There was just a couple exchanges of provinces. Jinx and I were calling it the phony war because we thought it was really strange. Like, why did they make peace so quickly? Why did they only exchange a couple provinces? And why were the casualties so incredibly low in this conflict between the two of them? There was barely any casualties. And so right then, we kind of thought that perhaps the Emu Empire and the SUF were in fact working together. So we kind of just started to approach it that way. I think the entire coalition had started to come to that conclusion. We saw that the Emu Empire was bringing ships next to all of our islands. So they had a ship here next to Sand Island. They had ships over here watching the Hawaiian Islands that were at that time all in HiJynx's control, which I think she only has Honolulu here at the end. But yeah, they had ships over here, and it was like a battleship. I think they just had like one battleship, one cruiser, which again were unescorted. They also did not escort their capital ships with destroyers, but they would have like one capital ship watching each of these. And initially it was kind of like you try and give them the benefit of the doubt, or maybe they had sent the unit on orders to patrol and patrol from here to here, and then they had just stopped. But then when those units didn't move and they just stayed there and they were clearly performing reconnaissance and watching what we had, what reason did they have to do that? And so right then we thought that they were an enemy. From that point on, we assumed that they had joined with the SUF here at the end of the game in order to, basically oppose the Legion from winning the game, which, after everything that was going on in Europe, we did, and South America, we did look like we were slated to win the game at that point. So we figured they had allied together, despite being former enemies. They had allied together in opposition against the Legion. So we had just started planning for that. I was still talking to Western Australia, the leader of the Emu Empire, and pretty much at that point was just giving him misinformation. I told him that we needed his assistance here in the Pacific. This was several days after the war with the SUF had started, and asked him if he could, provide the assistance here with his fleet, which he would need to join the war to do that, and actually help us out, because, I told him that we didn't have any ships here, and that I was right now assembling a fleet to come to the Pacific, but he was talking about, you guys should concentrate on the Atlantic, and we have the Pacific covered. And I told him, no, the Atlantic, we have a big navy. It's completely covered. There's no worries about the Atlantic. So that lie had two parts to it. First of all, I wanted him to believe that the Atlantic was completely covered, and that therefore there'd be no reason to send ships, him or the SUF, to send ships over here, because we would destroy them, which was not true. I had the submarines up along here. Obviously I have my naval bombers here, but these came much later. I didn't actually have all these at that point. I had my battleship fleet here in Europe. It was just one battleship and I think 2 cruisers and some 5 destroyers maybe. And I had that here in Europe, but that was it. There was nothing here in the Atlantic, and I was pumping troops across here. Now once we went to war with the SUF, I stopped sending unescorted troops, but there was already still several in the sea. As I said, it takes like 2 days to get across. So when I told him that, the Atlantic was not covered. It was covered with convoys. That's what it was covered with. I had so many convoys in the sea. So part of that lie was to try and keep the SUF and the Emu Empire out of the Atlantic so they didn't sink all my damn convoys. I didn't want them coming over here. I wanted them to feel like we had it covered, which we did not. And then the other part was to tell him that, the lie that I didn't have any ships here in the Pacific, but that I was sending some. And that lie was quite effective, I discovered later. Again, we'll talk about exactly how I discovered these things in later in the video. But that lie did end up working out. They had sent a fleet down here to watch the Panama Canal so they would know when I brought ships through the Panama Canal. So they would be aware of that fact when it was happening. But when I told them that, I had already gone through the Panama Canal. So I'd already had a fleet, and that was the fleet that is right here. Which is much smaller than it was at the time because it did take some casualties. But it was a battleship. It was a battleship and a cruiser with, I think, 5 or 6 destroyers. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was 6 destroyers, like 8 ships total or something like that. Maybe it was just 5 destroyers. I'm not entirely sure. But the point is that I did have a fleet over here already. I think when I told them that lie, I think they were here off the coast of Mexico, moving up over here to kind of help out in the Pacific, kind of defend against any invasions that might be happening. So yeah, they were a little bit surprised by me having a fleet here because they didn't expect that we'd have anything. But again, at that point, we started lying to them because we did assume that they were going to betray us. betray our non-aggression pact, to betray the alliance that we had with them, the official alliance, the public alliance that we had with them. And then we saw that they started moving more and more ships to our coast. They had ships all throughout British Columbia's ports. I think there was at least like one capital ship outside every one of British Columbia's ports. And they just brought more and more ships. Of course, British Columbia, when he first saw a ship over here by Sand Island, he contacted me, asked me, if there's anything, we need to be aware of when it comes to our relationship with them. And I told him, as of right now, we're allies, but let's just assume that they're working against us, that it does look awfully suspicious. And then, of course, once they moved all their ships over here, I told him how to contact them, but to prepare for conflict, that the conflict is probably going to be happening soon against the Emu Empire, when they just started moving all those ships over here. HiJynx wanted to contact them a lot earlier, because when a ship is outside of your view range and you can't see them, they just look like a convoy ship. So we knew that they had their capital ships over here, but there was a ship that HiJynx could see but couldn't see what it was, so it appeared to be a convoy. And so HiJynx figured it was a convoy unit, and she's like, what would you be having convoy units over here by Hawaii for, other than to attack us? Now that ship just ended up being a cruiser, wasn't a convoy, but HiJynx was ready to declare war right then. And I did tell her, I was like, we don't know that that's a troop convoy, you can't see it, could be anything, so let's not attack them yet. But the point was that we wanted to wait until, or at least I wanted to wait until I had more ships over here in the Pacific, before we engaged the Emu Empire. I had already brought the one fleet in here, but I didn't feel like that was enough because I knew that they probably had a lot more ships than us. So I was also bringing a fleet up here from the north that was going to first help out here in the situation against Alaska, or in Alaska, I should say, and then kind of move into the Pacific. And then I was putting together another fleet over here, which is this one right here now, another battleship fleet that I was bringing over here, and with plans as soon as that one started coming through here of building another one, which you can see is here as well. And this is my really large one that never really got to see combat, unfortunately. But yeah, I was planning on pumping troops into the Pacific, so I wanted to wait as long as possible before we engaged the Emu Empire, since I was very worried about them doing naval invasions of the Pacific. But they thought they had the surprise on us. They thought we didn't expect anything. They thought that we were going to be very easy to defeat here. And I guess we should talk about what was actually happening behind the scenes. So while we thought that the alliance between the Emu Empire and the SUF was, an alliance of convenience, an alliance to, oppose us from winning the game, that they're former enemies that were now coming together for their own survival. Turns out that that was not the case. It turns out the SUF and the Emu Empire had been working together for the entire match. So they actually had a Discord channel, which they later gave me access to, called the Secret Alliance. And these two had worked together the entire game with the intention of opposing us and the Legion, even well before, we were, slated to win the game. They were, allied with the idea that, nobody would know that they were allied. And so they had, set up the newspaper post against each other. They set up, phony wars against each other. That one that I talked about that we called the phony war was not the first phony war. I guess all of their conflicts together were all manufactured, all orchestrated, like everything they did, which was really, really cool. I thought that was awesome to see that they had this secret alliance the entire time. I mean, we had many secret alliances throughout the game as well. So I mean, that's not really surprising. There's probably a lot of alliances that I don't even know about, I have no knowledge of, that might have been happening between different coalitions. But have one that just was from the very beginning, like so early in the campaign. And then for them to have set it up the way they did, I thought that was just amazing, which was great reading their Discord, and they were so happy to see when we had set up an alliance with them, because we had so clearly we had no idea that they were, allied together at that time. So they were so happy to see that all their deception had worked, and that we thought the Emu Empire was our friends, or at least not friends, but at least we shared a common enemy. I'd say that's more accurate, the way that we looked at the Emu Empire at that time. So yeah, they were just so pleased to see that everything was working out the way they wanted. However, they thought that their deception was working all the way up to the point that they revealed the deception. Again, though, we knew pretty early, once we had our so-called alliance with the Emo Empire, that they were not allies and that they were in fact working against us. Again, just because I think the thing that tipped us off the most was the little phony war here that was obviously there's something fishy there. But also, you can't set your capital ships to go hang out by all your allied, all their ports and their islands with no reason or explanation. And then you're not even, and then when I talked to him about it, and I asked him, especially when he started moving them by the ports here, and I asked him, I said, hey, what do you got all these capital ships by our ports? And he sent a message back to me and said, well, we're just here to protect your cities in case the SUF attacks. We'll help defend them. And I said, well, that doesn't make any sense because you're not at war with the SUF. So if they were to come and attack, then your ships wouldn't do anything. You would have to be active and online when it happened, and able to react within the 4 hours it takes for their transports to unload. And more than likely, it just wouldn't be quick enough. You guys wouldn't be that helpful. I said, why don't you get your ships away from our ports and do what we had discussed you doing, and patrol the Pacific and find ships. But at this point, of course, I knew that he was an enemy, and I just didn't. I kind of wanted to call him out and see what he would do. And of course, he never responded. And I think they knew at that point. I think that's when they had discovered that we knew that they're an enemy. When I was demanding that he move his capital ships away from our ports. And what actually ended up happening was kind of a bit frustrating. And I'm just going to be honest here, guys. The SUF quit. They decided, and they put out multiple newspaper posts and said that they were quitting the campaign. And it happened at a very convenient time, immediately after their invasion of Africa failed. Pretty much right after that failed, they then decided they were going to quit. And I'm not going to lie. I'd say that all of us here in the Legion were irritated by that, kind of frustrated with it, because they started the conflict with us, not the other way around. They started the fight with us. It's kind of equivalent of like walking up and punching somebody in the face and then saying you quit the fight after we're ready to attack them. Just very convenient that they did it right as we were invading Europe. Clearly they were still posting newspaper posts in support of Europe on that day that they did their invasion. And it's day 17, day 18 that you're like quitting, somewhere around there, which is right after your invasion fails, right after I've defeated Poland and all the European Union's fallen, and they know that we are going to be on their borders in a matter of days. For me, that's just so convenient that you quit. That you're being a sore loser, in my opinion. That's the way I felt it was. And I am kind of a little bit salty about it because we were having a great conflict here. You have this really cool secret alliance here between the SUF and the Emu Empire that we didn't even know about until it became much closer to the conflict starting. We had no idea that they were working together the entire time. And so that was really cool. And you got this conflict, Alaska, and you got this Pacific naval war going on. I mean, you see what Emu Empire has built up. I mean, good God. I mean, it just would have been so fun to engage in this massive conflict against them. And instead, they were sore losers, and they pouted about their invasion failing, and then they quit. They quit right when we were about to smack them in the face and invade into their territory and get our revenge for them attacking us here in the Pacific and all the successes they had. They had a lot of successes here initially. And then finally, we're going to get to deal with them, and then they quit. Right when we're on their borders, me and Angola. They tried to explain why they quit. This game is really, really fun game. If you want to be competitive, though, it can be kind of time-consuming. You got to check it every day, multiple times a day. You got to be pretty active during conflicts, at least, as I talked about with that war with Poland and Sweden. I think a big reason why I was so successful in that was because of how active I was in it. So you got to be pretty active in conflicts if you want to be successful. So it can be quite time-consuming. I can understand that. And both South India and Sichuan had stated that they kind of felt like they needed their lives back. They needed to take a break, that they'd been spending too much time in it, probably an unhealthy amount of time. It's a very addicting game. Oh, good God, it's an addicting game, man. And Sichuan, for instance, had started 6 different campaigns that he was playing all at once, so he'd kind of gotten a little bit burned out. I understand that. I can see that being understandable, but to me, it feels like That's not true. Like, that's false, because first of all, if you got 6 campaigns going, you don't have to quit this one. Why are you quitting this one? Out of all the campaigns you're playing, why are you going to quit this one and not the other ones? You're quitting this one because you're losing this one and you know you're going to lose. And they also implied that they weren't going to play anymore. But then on their little secret server, Discord server that I later had access to, they were sitting there discussing after they had quit, days after they had quit, Western Australia and Sichuan were discussing doing a new campaign on Friday together, like starting a new campaign together where they're gonna, I don't know if they're gonna work together on that one or do something similar with the Secret Alliance type situation or what they were planning, but they're talking about starting a new campaign. So they're over here planning a new campaign just days away after you just quit this one. Why are you quitting this one other than the fact that you're being a sore loser? You're quitting because you lost. And you're not going to do the final battle, which is really frustrating. And then they try to say other excuses like, oh, well, you guys can just conquer South America and Europe, and then you'll win the game, so you don't even have to fight us. Which, two things. First of all, that's not true. Even if we did conquer all South America and Europe, we still wouldn't have had enough points. We would have had to go into Asia at least a little bit. Secondly, we were not really making much progress in South America because we intentionally, as I said earlier, we didn't want to conquer here because we didn't want to win the game by just beating the AI. I had decided to leave the Netherlands and Belgium and the Belgians alone. Spain, I decided not to attack them either. I eventually attacked them towards the end because we were just trying to get some points here. Although I never actually got any territory because it was like on the day before it ended, I think, is when I attacked them. I did kill a lot of them, though. They had a ton of troops. Good God, they had a stupid amount of troops here. And they're in the mountains, and the Spanish player, before he left, had been worried about France, so he had built level 2 forts in his territory here. He had told me about that he was fortifying up in preparation for conflict with France. So level 2 forts with a lot of troops, a lot of artillery and anti-air, and just, it was a tough fight there. But I had a pretty good kill-death ratios despite, but still, I didn't attack until the very end there when we were just trying to get victory at that point. So yeah, we weren't going to just conquer the AI countries. We were going to invade them. That was always the plan, because that's how we wanted to have the win. We wanted it to be this epic final battle against the SUF and the Emu Empire. I think it would have just been fantastic, and instead unfortunately they quit. So I'm not gonna lie, it was kind of frustrating that the entire SUF decided to quit. None of them kept playing. Siberia, I guess we'll talk about that when I start the invasion here, but when I started the invasion of Siberia, he went AI the next day, which means that he had been active for a little while. East Yakutia was soon after that. Communist China, I think, always was still active. Sichuan was, I think, the day before it all ended. Or actually, it might have been the day it ended is when he went inactive, so I don't know how much of a role he played. Actually, when we were doing the invasion, it didn't seem like much because units were mostly just sitting still. South India had gone inactive also, I think, a day or two after the invasion, so he had clearly been inactive when we invaded as well. So they definitely were all inactive. And that resulted in the Emu Empire not wanting to play anymore either since their ally was leaving. And so they had all said that they were going to quit too. Now, luckily, the Emu Empire did not quit. But they did send their invasion forward probably before it was entirely ready. So they sent a massive invasion forward that they had been planning. A lot of convoyed troops over here, big navy that they sent after us as a kind of like a final thing. So I don't know if they're entirely ready for it or if they're being serious when they sent it off. Their newspaper post made it seem like they weren't. Like they were just kind of throwing it forward and like they were going to quit too. Now, luckily they didn't quit. They kept on playing, and I'm glad they did. I thank them for, being good sports and continuing despite the fact that you weren't going to win. So I'm really happy that all of them stayed active. Borneo, Papua New Guinea, Western Australia here, and New Zealand. They all did stay active and kept playing, which I'm glad to see. I was very happy with that. So thanks, guys, for continuing and not quitting like your allies did. I was quite. I'm not trying to be too harsh to them because they seem like nice guys, but I just felt like you're being a sore loser, and you're not. I don't know. I just feel like you got this big epic battle here that would have been so much fun. Oh man, and we'll talk about this here when we look at Siberia and my invasion there. It could have been a epic conflict against them. It would have been a lot of fun, and instead they quit. But we did have some fun battles here in the Pacific that I'd like to discuss. So I was actually offline when the Emu Empire launched their invasion, and I think I had just gotten offline maybe 45 minutes before they launched their invasion. So I don't know if they knew when I typically went inactive or whatever, but yeah, they launched it about 45 minutes after I'd gotten off. So by the time I'd gotten on, the invasion had already been well underway, and so I can't really give specifics or even show too much video because again I wasn't on when it happened. But I do know what Kentucky and British Columbia told me. They sent a big old massive invasion of again convoy troops over here with a large navy, and Kentucky kind of saved the day over here with his rockets. So he has these rockets here. He had built quite a few of those, and apparently he launched those into the Emu Empire's navy and just decimated them. The amount of casualties, just tens and tens of thousands of dead within hours. His rockets were highly effective, just devastating them. British Columbia also had very good kill-death ratio against the Emu Empire when they invaded. So I don't know exactly all what he did, but I know he killed quite a few of them. By the time I had gotten on, there was a couple capital ships kind of still remaining up along the coast here, but for the most part, much of their force here against the British Columbia had been destroyed. Now they did have a large force that had invaded or went after California, HiJynx's territory in California. We'll discuss that here in a little bit. But yeah, they did have that force, which took a little bit longer for us to wrap up. But I had brought my fleet over here. Again, we had that one fleet here, which I think is this one over here with the battleship name of, because this is how I know my fleet's based on their names. So this is the HiJynx fleet. So that was not the fleet, I don't think. I think it was this one here, the Boston. Yeah, so the Boston fleet was actually the one that did it. The HiJynx fleet came a little bit later. The HiJynx fleet actually came from up here. In the north, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the HiJynx fleet came from up around here, while the Boston fleet, and then this one I think is, the one in Europe is Praetorian. This battleship, which I think I actually have two battleships here, is the USS Pennsylvania and the USS New York. And then I had a USS Praetorian or whatever that was the one in Europe that was concentrated over there, which is now up here in the north. So those are my battleship fleets. And so the Boston was the main fleet over here at the time, and it was up here because I was sending him up to help in Alaska, and then when I saw that HiJynx was getting hit kind of hard and she did not have the naval or air forces at the time to deal with them, she did have a good number of ground troops here because again, the Emu Empire expected to find a very undefended North America, and I'm not entirely sure why they expected that. They had told me that, you know, they saw that we were in Europe and South America, so they expected that, you know, all of our troops were engaged in those two areas, and it would take them way too long to get back to North America. But I'm not entirely sure why they were thinking that, considering the fact that it was really just me and HiJynx down here in South America, and then in Europe it was just me and Angola. So then you've got British Columbia, who of course has got to be in North America to deal with the Alaska situation, and then you got Kentucky still here in North America as well. So I'm not entirely sure why they thought that they were going to find an undefended North America, but it was very well defended. You know, railroad guns all across the coast. HiJynx had railroad guns covering her coast. She had troops all in the cities defending them, artillery across the coast as well. So she did have land forces that were able to engage in the fleet. But overall, their fleet probably would have won here if she hadn't built up the Navy built up her Air Force and really started getting the naval bombers pumping up here. But even then, she was taking very heavy casualties. So I decided I was going to move the Boston battleship fleet down there to assist her. However, instead I ended up discovering a Borneo fleet that was retreating because the Emu Empire had saw that their invasion up here had failed, so the rockets were devastating. So they had decided to retreat all of the remaining ships. In Borneo, I caught a very large fleet of 25 ships total. Now, only 5 of those were warships, including one carrier. I think it was one carrier, one cruiser, maybe 2 cruisers. I'm not entirely sure, and then like 2 destroyers. Something, I'm not entirely sure of the composition. But the point was that there was a carrier with 2 naval bombers on it, and then they had 20 convoys that were, troop convoys. And so when I saw that with my battleship fleet, I had to engage it. I can't, neglect an opportunity to take out a carrier and 20 convoy troops. So I engaged them over here, and I ended up sinking most of them. I think one or two ships got away. I did sink the carrier, though. I did sink all the troop convoys. I think one of the cruisers or one of the destroyers got away. But other than that, we were able to sink those. And then I continued bringing the Boston over here to help out on the Pacific coast. So again, while it was Western Australia and Borneo that seemed to be attacking British Columbia, it was Papua New Guinea that was attacking California. Now, as for New Zealand, I don't think he ever attacked anywhere. I didn't really see any of his ships anywhere. I think he kind of stayed on the defensive. As you can see here, he's got a massive defensive fleet here. So I think he kind of stayed on the defense instead of attacking. Or that's the way it seemed anyway, because I don't recall seeing too many of New Zealand's ships anywhere. But this was Papua New Guinea. He invaded into Hawaii. He had a battleship fleet that... or a couple battleships, I should say. They weren't really fleets. He kind of kept all his ships separate, which I think was a mistake on his part. But he bombarded the Hawaiian Islands and destroyed destroyed all the units here, and then eventually sent troops over here to take control of the Hawaiian Islands everywhere except for Honolulu. HiJynx did do pretty heavy casualties to him over here, though. But over here, things did not go as well for HiJynx. She took very heavy losses, just wrecked her kill-death ratio. She wasn't happy about that because she had a pretty good kill-death ratio at that point. And she took very, very high casualties along the coast here. Despite having the artillery and the railroad guns, they don't really do super well against ships. So she was sinking their ships, but for the most part, she was taking much higher casualties from what the Papua New Guinea's capital ships are just wrecking all of her troops, everything that she had along here. So she did get naval bombers out here. Eventually, she lost all of those. As you see here, she has more, but she lost her whole naval bomber fleet. And eventually, was so desperate, she resorted to putting tactical bombers out here and bombing with tactical bombers, which don't do a ton of damage against ships, but they do a little bit. But that's at the point that she was at, just trying to deal with all of these ships that were on her coast, because there was a lot of them. And so I brought the Boston down here, eventually arrived again. It got distracted with that Borneo fleet, but eventually arrived here and just kind of started just easily wrapping up that Papua New Guinea's fleet, because again, they were all separated. If I had to fight all the cruisers and battleships all at once, he would have defeated the Boston and the fleet that was there. But instead, I was able to engage them separately. I'd also brought a submarine up, and again, just like British Columbia, he did not escort his capital ships with destroyers, so the submarine was able to wreak havoc on his ships. I think the submarine sunk multiple battleships and sunk one cruiser. And he had a massive fleet, guys. The Boston sunk a lot of ships, and again, if I had to engage 3 battleships of 5 cruisers all at once, or whatever his fleet was here, if I had to fight them all at the same time, they would have won. But because they were all separate and all along the coast here, I was able to engage them one by one and easily destroy them with a little bit of damage to my own fleet. But overall, wasn't too bad. Now, I did lose quite a few destroyers in that battle against Borneo. I think I lost 3 destroyers. So my fleet was vulnerable to submarines. I think I only had maybe 2 destroyers still there. But eventually I moved more destroyers up. I brought like 3 or 4 destroyers up to kind of reinforce. And after I destroyed the fleet here, I kind of let them sit here and wait for the destroyers to, combine with them before I sent them off to Hawaii. And he did try one more attempt to kind of deal with the coast here. He sent a carrier over here full of interceptors, and I don't think it had any naval bombers on it. It just had interceptors to deal with what by that point was a very large naval bomber air force that HiJynx had built up. So she had moved all her tactical bombers elsewhere and had got a bunch of naval bombers built, which were just wreaking havoc in any ships he tried to send here. As you can see, she has very good coverage here. I can't really get anywhere without getting bombed. And so he had brought a carrier with interceptors to try and shoot down all of her planes. And I'll show in the video here because she did take very high damage. He even shot down, I think, a naval bomber or 2. But for the most part, he had just done damage to all the naval bombers. And then I caught the carrier just sitting out here, and I sunk that before I continued on towards Hawaii. By that point, I now had another battleship fleet down here, and that was the HiJynx. She had come from around here, and it kind of helped bombard here. There were several destroyers up here from East Yakutua that it sunk. Then when it came over here, I caught some convoys trying to get across, sunk those. Submarine engaged several of them as well. I lost a submarine here that destroyed a battleship, by the way. Eventually it was destroyed by the destroyers, but he did sink a battleship before he sunk. And then there was a huge air force that was positioned here. Part of it was East Akatua, the other part was Sichuan. Because they're inactive, it was just sitting here. I brought the battleship HiJynx over here and destroyed all of them. It was like 25 planes total, maybe a little bit more than that, that I was able to destroy at the airbase that were just sitting on the airbase. So after that, the HiJynx then traveled across the Pacific, came over here. I think there might have been a unit here it destroyed real quick. And then from there, yeah, I think it bombarded a unit and destroyed that. And then from there, then continued on to Hawaii, where I destroyed all the units that were here, kind of primed it for HiJynx to re-invade it. Though, of course, as you can see, she never got there before the end of the campaign. She did have troops set up to get it all back. Also engaged all the ships that were attempting retreat here. Several, Papua New Guinea's capital ships. I had a couple battleships here and cruisers that I sunk with both my battleship fleet and my submarines. But overall, pretty fun. I think this is the one battleship that got away. As you can see, he's a little bit damaged here. I tried chasing him down, but I didn't know how far he'd gotten. He got pretty far. But really fun doing all these naval battles. Had a blast with it. I'm so glad that the Emu Empire, stayed in the conflict and kept fighting. And you know what? If we had tried to invade them, you could see their territory. It would have been a challenging invasion. Good God. I mean, look at how well defended their coasts are. They got artillery everywhere. No railroad guns though. But yeah, like some mobile forces to, attack anywhere where we happen to hit. Carriers all throughout here. Very large fleets. You see that they have Indian Ocean, and they have a little bit of this covered here. Again, unescorted cruisers, it would have been very easy to sink though. Those destroyers probably would not have gotten up there in time to deal with any attacks by submarines. But pretty well defended coast, less so in some areas. I think Borneo's coast is the best, most well defended with the exception of New Zealand, I suppose. Australian coast would have been a lot easier to make some progress here, though he did defend all his key cities. And then also Papua New Guinea, I think he must have lost a lot of troops on those invasions because his coasts are not very well defended. So we would have probably had a lot of success there. But yeah, look at these fleets, man. Just battleships and cruisers all over the place. Some of them actually escorted, most of them not though. So submarines would have been able to wreak havoc over here. But yeah, a lot of battleships all throughout here. Looks like New Zealand had a template for his fleets with 1 destroyer, 2 cruisers, and a battleship is what he seemed to be rocking here with many of these. I don't know if that's exactly a good design. Those destroyers would be too easy to sink, and then once again your submarines will just be able to wreak havoc on them. So I don't know if that's good, but still, this would have been difficult. You got naval bombers all around here. I mean, this would have been very difficult to get in here if we had invaded them. But again, we did focus on SUF because, at that time, when we had made these plans, we didn't know they were going to quit. But that's the battle in the Pacific, which did rage all throughout the match until the very end. We were fighting them, though. You can see that we had started to push them back, and they were now on the retreat, bringing all their ships out, and we had pretty much dealt with them. But sunk a lot of their ships through here. They did face very heavy casualties overall. My kill-death ratio against them was very, very good against Borneo, Papua New Guinea. I don't think I engaged Western Australia much. I sunk a couple of their ships, and then again, never fought New Zealand. But yeah, very good kill-death ratio for me in the seas. And we would have gained Australia back, and eventually, we probably would have attempted an invasion here, Angola from one side and us from the other. So with that done, let's just discuss the final, the end of the conflict here, which was the invasion of the SUF, which again was a little bit lackluster, a little bit anticlimactic because they had quit. But it does need to be discussed since this was how we finished the game up. So up along this border, Siberia had, and it was right here actually, Siberia had built level 2 forts, not through the entire, now some of these were destroyed, these were level 1s I think. But yeah, you had the level 2 forts, the entire border was fortified though. On top of that, there was mountains, which again are very difficult to fight in for the most part because it's so slow going through them. So he had built these fortifications along here. I think that this would have been very difficult for me to invade through, which is why I wasn't planning on doing that. Instead, I have a right of access through Volga Nizhny, so I actually sent troops through this direction here into this territory. And so I went through his land, and if we had been fighting Siberia, like an active Siberia, I would have just kept enough troops here just to defend. I think I'd built my own forts along here just in case, because he wasn't inactive at that point. And I probably would have, bombarded him a bit. But man, those fortifications, as we talked about in my own conflicts, I already knew that was not a good strategy. So I had invaded into here, and I eventually then also invaded into this direction since he was inactive. Again, planes did dominate throughout here. I had to build air bases as I moved across to make sure that this air wing here was able to help me out as I went. The railroad guns were almost useless. They helped out in the initial attack, but they're just so slow that they really weren't able to engage in this very mobile offensive. So yeah, I just kind of invaded into his territory, moved pretty quick. It's fairly easy. He had a lot of troops though, so I took some casualties, but overall kill death ratio very, very good. But overall, it was the AI did take over, so it was a fight because the AI took over the day after I invaded. So I did have to fight. It wasn't like just a bunch of units sitting around and easy to kill. As you can see, they did take territory back. They kind of got behind me a little bit because I was moving so quick with the light tanks. They got behind me a little bit, so it was a good fight. Again, though, did pretty well. Conquered up to here before and started getting into East Yakutu's territory before we won. And I was doing that while Angola was invading into South India. South India was inactive, I think, a day or two after his invasion, but I think for the most part he had conquered most of South India before he had went inactive, which means the units weren't moving around, so that made it a little bit quicker, I think. He also had a big naval battle here against South India's carrier force, which was pretty cool to watch. So he engaged all his ships that were off the coast here. By that point, Angola had created a massive navy, probably the largest navy in the game. Up throughout the entire campaign, I had the largest navy of the Legion, the largest navy of our coalition. But by the end of the game, Angola's navy was extremely large, much larger than mine. So he had built a big old fleet, destroyed South India's fleet, and then just, progressed through his territory and quickly conquered them, and then moved into Sichuan's territory and conquered all that as well. And again, they eventually all went inactive. And then he started moving into Communist China's territory too, when we had enough victory points to win the game. Again, kind of anticlimactic. Volganishny, just to mention him real quick, he did end up invading Kazakhstan right about when we were invading the SUF, around the same time. He didn't want to do it before because he was worried about the SUF seen as active aggression and declaring war on him. He was very concerned about causing problems with either them or the EU. So like, for instance, he knew that the Polish territory all throughout here was undefended as he sent more troops to fight me. And yet he didn't want to invade into Polish territory and take over that because he was worried about the SUF invading him. Same thing with here. He didn't want to invade into Kazakhstan until it was clear that the SUF was done for. So that's the reason why he didn't really get much territory besides what he had already had, just because he was kind of being a bit cautious with it, I would say. Just, at one point he was completely surrounded by the EU and SUF, so I can kind of see why he was being cautious. I think that's understandable. But I think he could have got involved a lot sooner and could have got a bit more territory for the end here. Of course, that would have made it more difficult for us to get victory. We would have had to conquer more of Asia if he had done that. So I guess it was probably good for us that he was pretty cautious with it. But again, he was very helpful with giving that intel. And as we promised, he did get to exist to the end of the game. Same thing with Persia. We never attacked them despite the fact that they did lose their territory and he did go inactive. I mean, you can see here, he was never at war with us, just with the SUF and Iraq. So yeah, we kept our promise. We never did attack these two, Persia and Volganishny. They did get to survive to the end of the game, and that was the campaign, guys. So then on day 24, we had achieved enough victory points and had won. So again, I kind of feel like it would have been better just for like the fun of everything if we had just not invaded the SUF, just set up like defenses here, and then instead focused on invading the Emu Empire, who was still playing up to the end of the game. I think that would have been funner. It would have been incredibly challenging, I think, with these defenses they set up. Again, there's a lot of weak points where I think we could have had a lot of success. Angola's navy was massive, so he could have dealt with all of the ships along this side of things fairly easily, I think. My navy, as you guys can see here, while I have these two smaller battleship fleets that did most of the fighting, and again, they did take casualties, so they were a little bit larger than this originally. I had brought a very large fleet over here, and this was one carrier, which had 3 naval bombers and a fighter. That's the most I could put on there since the carriers aren't that upgraded. They're only level 3. 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 7 destroyers, for a total of 14 ships and 4 planes. So I had that, and then of course I had these 2 fleets, and then the other one that was coming up around the edge here and would eventually be able to enter into the Pacific. And I was building more ships. I had another fleet that I was building up right there. I mean, so I feel like I could have taken out this fleet here. It would have been tough though, because of the fact that they had so many naval bombers. So we would have needed more carriers, more interceptors to deal with the naval bombers. But again, because of the way their fleets are composed, I feel like if we could have just brought submarines in and eventually just wreaked havoc. As soon as you get rid of the destroyers, which are typically the first thing that gets destroyed when 2 large battleship fleets are shooting at each other. I mean, you got 1 destroyer. I mean, I would have destroyed it easily, sunk it, and then I could have just moved on to go sink the next destroyer and brought the submarines in to destroy all of your capital ships. So that's how I probably would have approached it. Would have brought a lot of submarines. I'd found a lot of success doing that against Papua New Guinea, since again he didn't escort his capital ships. So I think that's what I would have done. Brought these big old fleets here, kind of deal with the destroyers, maybe deal with the capital ships a little bit. Bring carriers with the interceptors to deal with the naval bombers, and then from that point on, just use submarines to sink all the capital ships. And invasions would have been tough. I think we would have taken high casualties, but eventually we would have. I think we would have been successful, and we would have been able to conquer them. And I think it would have been a lot funner than conquering inactive countries. So if I could do it all over again, I think that's what we would have done. But overall, I really had a lot of fun in the campaign, between all the role-playing and the newspaper posts and secret alliances that we never knew about, and just all the different coalitions and the wars, and man, it was intense. It was a lot of fun, guys. I had so much fun that I would definitely like to do another one of these campaigns sometime in the future. And next time we're talking about, and I've been talking with Angola with this because he's a very experienced player and a good guy that's, as I've talked about last episode, kind of helped us learn the game and just been helpful quite a bit overall. And I think he's also on the support staff for the game. So kind of been in discussion with him on different things we could do. I've come up with some rules I think would be really good to try and slow down expansion and maybe slow down more experienced players. Yeah, I feel like with some rules to kind of limit expansion, slow it down, and maybe just some role-playing rules, I think we could really make a really fun campaign that resulted in slower expansion and overall not quite one coalition such as the Legion dominating so quickly and so easily. So I would like to do another one with different rules. I'd like to show the current points here as we end it so you guys can see. Angola was, you have to have, we just go to the newspaper here. You have to win 3,877 points for the coalition to win. You see Emo Empire has 510, the SUF only has 221. They had 500 something, or wait a minute, no, excuse me, they had 1,000, I think. Before we started conquering their territory. I think they're sitting at about 1,000. So about double the size of the Emu Empire. And at the time that we were fighting them, we were about double the size of them. So together, they actually were almost as powerful as the Legion. Not quite, but considering the fact that many of our countries weren't going to be helping out in the war against the SUF and the Emu Empire, at least for a little while, I think they would have outnumbered us, especially against the SUF. It would have just been me and Angola fighting them. They would have been more powerful than us, and they're in the home territory on the defense with fortifications. I think it would have been a very tough fight for us, and it would have been a lot of fun. Such a bummer they left. But yeah, you can see that we have 3,998 points, almost 4,000 points of the 3,877 needed for victory. And again, the reason why we have so many more is because it's calculated at the end of day. That's why I say we won in day 24, even though technically we actually won in day 25 when it went to the end of day. So you can see how those points that Angola has, you know, half of them, half of the points, a little over half of the points, while I have 922. So essentially I was just as powerful as the SUF was by myself by the end of the game. So I was the second player, but Angola definitely dominated this campaign. And then you can see Texas was next. She was third place with 383, so HiJynx did very, very well. British Columbia was in fourth place. Communist China in fifth place, since we hadn't really gotten his territory yet. Kentucky was over here in sixth. Western Australia in seven. Boganishny 8, so on, so on. So you can kind of see how this looks on the remaining players. But yeah, very fun campaign overall. I had a blast. So yeah, glad that I did pretty well. I think I was the second best player for most of the campaign. Once I'd gone into France, I think I'd gone into second place. So I'm glad to see that I did well despite being a new player. Things could have went very differently if certain players would have stayed in, you know. For instance, Goyes had stayed in. I think it would have been really interesting, the South American conflict. And again, if the SUF had stayed in, I think that could have been a real fun war too. I would like to do another one at some point. I don't know exactly when that would be, but you know, sometime in the future, maybe we'll start a new campaign. I'll kind of announce that on the channel when that point comes. But I would like to play another one, if that's something you guys would be interested in. Another option would be doing a smaller map, since these big maps do take a while, and you know, there's a lot to them because, you know, 100 players and just a massive amount of territory to get conquered. So there's also smaller maps that we could play as well. I'd love to hear your input on it. But again, I had so much fun that I would like to do another campaign at some point. Yeah, that's going to be the end of this video and the end of this sponsored series. I feel like I'm losing my voice here at the end because I talk so much, because this is a pretty long video. I know I got to do a lot of editing and stuff, but it's going to be a long video. But I wanted to properly cover everything. And again, I just had so much fun, and I just wanted to do justice to the campaign overall. These long videos actually weren't required of, you know, the sponsored series. I just did them because, again, I had so much fun. I just wanted to talk about all of them, everything that was happening. So I hope you guys did enjoy the series overall, because, again, I had a lot of fun between, you know, playing the game and just doing these videos. So I hope that you liked it too. And yeah, this is the end. So I do hope to see you guys on another video. If you liked this one, make sure you leave a like on the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell. And remember, if you're looking to play the game, we do still have that link in the description of this video, as well as in the pinned comment, which will give you those benefits if you join as a new player. And again, I can't recommend this game enough, and there's certain elements that I really like about it. And I'm just surprised about how much I have enjoyed it, because typically I don't like games like this. But man, I've just, and the fact that HiJynx liked it too, I think is really saying something of it, that she had a lot of fun too, and we're probably going to continue playing, just because, not this match obviously, because this one's over. But yeah, we'd like to start another match here in a couple weeks, just, you know, her and me playing together, because yeah, we just had a lot of fun with it. Just certain elements of it I really like. I think the real-time element is, for me, really cool. You know, just how it takes days to do anything, just all that planning, you know, spending days and days of planning something, an invasion, and just seeing it all happen, and just playing against real players. Of course, I like the multiplayer aspect, is a lot of fun. So yeah, I've had a blast with this game. So if you'd like to try it out, then try that link down in the description of the video. And I do hope that if we do another series, that maybe you'll get a little bit of experience and maybe join us on that next match whenever that happens to be. So yeah, again, thanks for watching this series. Hope you did enjoy it. I do hope to see you on another video. And thanks for watching, guys.